part of the thing about doing the long form conversation style is people see the errors. They see where you misspoke and you had to backpedal and you started in the middle of a conversation and they tend to take it more seriously or it comes off as more genuine. So people kind of like that. That's part of the reason that this whole long form thing has gotten so popular. So,
Okay.
so yeah, I'm okay with the weirdness, and mistakes and stuff.
Yeah, I guarantee you I will misspeak.
Yeah, it's fine. So introduce yourself.
Gordon Smith.
Yeah.
I'm a
Agent Smith.
Agent Smith, retired U.S. Navy chief. See, that's just a really challenging question. Like, who are you? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you're 53 years old, heading to be 53 years old, and then, what does a midlife crisis look like, and how do you know if you're having one? I'm pretty sure I'm not having one. So things that I've done. One, retired Navy chief, served in the Navy for 16 years. Before that, I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps. Started out in the Marines, jokingly say I learned to read and write, transitioned to the Navy, became a hospital corpsman, did that for 16 years. In between the Marines and the Navy, which is about a time span of about 2.5 years from roughly the middle of 1994 so June 1994 to January 97. I was out of the Marines, went to community college, Portland Community College for 2 years. Studied mainly political science, economics. Did have some friends that transitioned me over to studying pre-med because one of my classmates was like, "You just have a mind for medicine and the sciences and all that." I'm horrible at math.
So probably just haven't had the right teacher.
That I get the big concepts. So
Yeah.
maybe like Einstein, like I get the big concepts, but if you're asking me to break down, like currently struggling with standard deviation and the equation for standard deviation, but I have to take it all apart and put it all back together so I can completely understand the concept.
Yeah.
So wandered around college for 2 years. My strengths were political science, economics. Political science, economics. Did get all the way up and through differential calculus, business calc, all that good stuff. Was getting into integral calc and then just was taking physics-based or calculus-based physics, and that kind of whooped my backside. And I was like, kind of like the human. And I was pretty much lost. Then had some crazy stuff happen, and I was like, all right, this is boring. Haven't been to war, haven't blown anything up, haven't been to any foreign countries. It's time to go back into the service. So decided on the Navy, decided to be a hospital corpsman, and the main reason was to outflank the Marine Corps. Because I was going to go back into the Marine Corps, and they're like, hey, you scored a 98 on your ASVAB. You can go in and work intelligence and electronics. And I'm like, look, here's the deal with electronics, okay? I understand it in theory. But if you want your house or your car to blow up, I'm the person to wire it for you.
Yeah.
Because I will inevitably mess something
So you're
up.
good on a test, but not so much in real life.
Better with people in real life. Because that's why medicine worked for me. So I chose hospital corpsman, and medicine worked for me because people will give you hints and clues about what's wrong with them. Like they'll walk in and be like, hey doc, my right knee hurts. And I'm like, well, I could tell that from the way you were walking on the way in.
Yeah.
And so medicine can get to be rather intuitive if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
And join the Navy, go to hospital corps school. Definitely afraid to go on a ship in the U.S. Navy or anything like that. I just wanted to go straight back to the Marines. Got my wish, ended up in 29 Palms, California at the end of 1997. Almost did get what's called high year tenure out of the Navy because my 6 years in the Marines and my time in the Navy, I was always up against just possibly getting kicked out of the Navy for not having advanced at the proper rate. Yeah. So they didn't account for my prior.
You were advancing too fast or not fast enough?
No, they looked at it and say, hey, you're advancing too slow. So with 6 years of service, I went from a sergeant in the Marine Corps E5 to an HN in the Navy, which is an E3. And so I had to pick up third class petty officer on my first time, and I had to pick up second class petty officer within like 3 years of joining the Navy.
You know, you don't strike me as a Navy guy or a Marine. Most of them you can peg them pretty easily because it's like their soul has been beaten out of them, you know? Like you are now officially a part in a moving machine, and that's all you are, but you don't have that. It's like you still know how to think for yourself.
Which is why I went the independent duty corpsman route. And one of the things that I did struggle with in the military, and it's simply living proof that we can fit ourselves into a system
Mm-hmm.
if we're willing to adapt ourselves into it. So I'm, and talk to my parents about this, anti-authoritarian by nature to a certain extent. It's like if someone comes out and says, this is the only way to do something, and if this is how we're going to do it, I'm the one that's going to stand back and go, well, is that the best way to do it? Is it because there's a difference between efficiency and proficiency. Proficiency means you can, and you can help me out. You're good with words, so you can help me out with. Proficiency means you can perform the task,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And generally you can do it the same way every time and repeat it. You're proficient at the task. Like a proficient writer can sit down and write and they can knock it out. Efficiency is different. Efficiency is I would say numbers based, more assembly line based. Um, so I'm always the one kicking back, going, well, is that the best way for me to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it's Thompsonism when we, in economic terms,
Okay.
we Henry Ford on the assembly line did this before. I believe it was Thompson came in and said it starts with a T, or Thomasism. Um, and then you come in and you study every step in the production process,
Mm-hmm.
and you try and make each step as efficient as possible. So what Ford does is people look at Henry Ford and say he was great for the workers because he paid them a living wage. You know, he was paying them, I believe, $5 a day, which was like just far and above anything else. And he also went on to create the 4-day work week. But the thing is he extracted as much production from his crew, from his assembly line workers as he could. And they weren't great conditions. We're talking 10 hours a day, with limited breaks, and somebody literally standing over your shoulder saying you can do that more quickly. So I'm pretty sure it was Thomas and Thomasism. And so that flows in to, you can see that flow into the Marine Corps and the Navy. What the Navy ended up doing when I joined, and this drove me up the wall because Dr. George Deming was the guy that rebuilt Japan after World War II, which is one of the reasons that the Japanese were so efficient at what they did, was because of Dr. George Deming. Well, the Navy steps in and tries to adapt that and do what's called total quality leadership. Okay.
Which is another word for micromanaging, I'm
Total quality management, very similar to Thompsonism, but it's the point of you want to manage the whole life cycle of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but it fits, not to pick on the Navy, but or the military in general, but it's kind of, the computer analogy comes up. It's garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you try and take someone that doesn't have an analytical mind and ask them to assess a situation and write about it, and they don't have the skill set,
Mm-hmm.
nothing's going to happen.
Mm.
It led to things like, in order to be advanced to chief or senior chief, you should get your associate's degree. And if you go talk to old school chiefs and old school gunnery sergeants, they'll be like, what does an associate's degree have to do with killing people, blowing things up, and running this ship?
Yeah.
Because it gets into your blood. It's what you do.
So in the military, I haven't been part of it, but I would have to imagine that you move up through the ranks by jumping through the appropriate hoops. Is that
Yes.
generally true?
That is true. The big thing in the Navy is if there's a chance to get a qualification like your surface warfare qualification. So enlisted surface warfare qualification means you know how to fight the ship, okay? Which is the officer's job, the naval officer's job on a combat ship is to fight the ship. The enlisted crew are there to support the officer crew so they can fight the ship and defend the ship and accomplish the mission. All right.
Okay.
That's my take on it. But that's also spelled out in U.S. Navy regulations, so on and so forth. So, yeah. So to move up through the ranks, you want to, the Navy does testing. Okay. So it's a testing based organization. When I was in, you took a test every 6 months called your advancement exam to advance in rate. So enlisted sailors advance, Marines, Army, Air Force, everyone else gets promoted. But we advance in our rate. So it's actually a common phrase that gets messed up when you ask, oh, my youngest son just got promoted in the Navy. Okay, he's an officer? No, he's enlisted. Well, he advanced in rate. It's a little nuance, but so to advance in rate, you do take a test every 6 months. It's based on your rate training manual that's put together by a bunch of people that probably have never done your job, but pick out things that they think are important for you to understand. For the most part, they're very well done. I mean, I know I just spoke disparagingly about them, but they are very well done. So
it's been only recently that I've really started to think about authority structures, and I can see why there are so many different experiments still, because it's really hard to find an authority structure that's effective, that doesn't dehumanize and really takes advantage of everyone's skills. And of course, I put all my study into theology, or my primary study is theology, and so church authority structures are fascinating to me, and I'm trying to figure that out right now.
Okay, well, at the top is God. We got that one.
The church authority structure, Jesus said, I'm the head and you're all brethren. The end. You're all different parts of the body. You're going to function in different ways, but I'm in charge, and you're all equal. You're all under me. And you won't find that in any church.
No, because that would be one up on top and then a horizontal leadership structure. And humans, for the most part, are just not designed that way. Most people do like to follow. They do like to be in a group where they fit into part of social cohesion. One of the benefits of a workplace is having people around you and being able to interact with them. That's quite helpful.
Yeah, the company that I work at, it's very strange. And right away, I flew to LA to meet these people, and there was no human resources department for this company, and there were maybe 15 to 20 employees or something like that, maybe as high as 30, and some people just weren't around. But they didn't have. There's no human resources department. I'm trying to figure this out, and then I realized that the CEO, who I'm sort of sitting next to, writing code with, and his brother, who was kind of high up, he was one of the first ones there, who's also sitting there writing code. And then the people who are like managing stuff, nobody's talking to each other really, except like to answer a question. So the question, like, who's in charge, was a weird question to them. What do you mean, who's in charge? He's in charge of that. I'm in charge of this. You're in charge of this now. Everybody was in charge. There wasn't a top-down structure, and everything they touched, they were making money. It's like they could do no wrong. And it was immediately like the most amazing work environment I've ever been part of, because they hired people who could manage themselves and think for themselves, and they put them in charge of a thing, and then they just communicated as necessary. The way that it works, it's like you wouldn't think that was possible. And as compared to my previous job, where you had the CEO who was making financial decisions based on numbers, who would just randomly, you're fired. Why? Numbers. Go get a new job. Well, you're laid off. And then so this guy is gone, and then the whole system starts to crumble.
Right.
Because it turns out that this guy was an essential part of the system, that no one else knows how to do his job. And so then, a few months later, they're scrambling to hire this person back.
Right. Who's now not happy.
Yeah, and probably, okay, if I'm going to come back, I need a new signing bonus and I want higher salary. And
So, professionally, I had a similar situation. So I was technically I was the assistant agreements coordinator at a certain research facility, naval research facility. Loved working there, loved being around scientists. Nothing moved. Not a dollar in that facility moved unless there was an agreement in place. There was essentially two people responsible for those agreements. Okay, my immediate supervisor, who was the agreements coordinator, but had just a tremendous amount of work on her plate because she had the whole financial department. And then there was the assistant. And the assistant had to do all the liaisoning and like there's at that time 416 different government agencies that you would have to speak to possibly move data and money if you were coordinating agreements. So let's say we wanted to work with the Center for Disease Control and share data on COVID statistics. Okay, so you have to have a data use agreement in place. You have to have a monetary agreement in place, memorandum of agreement, because it's between two government agencies. But it's all centered on this poor agreements coordinator who's working at that time, it was $50K a year for 12 to 14 hours out of my day between the moment I left, cracked the front door of the humble Smith abode in Spring Valley, California, which was a wonderfully cute little house. But from leaving that door at between 6 and 6:30 in the morning to coming back in at between 6 and 7 o'clock at night. At $50K a year with, and I think it was a little over $20K in childcare expenses, plus fuel, plus food, so on and so forth. So it turns out I was plus a whopping $18,000 to $20,000 a year for having that job. But the thing is that the amount of stress associated with it, because I literally would have scientists showing up going, "Hey, Gordon, I'm doing this study." And a lot of time, one of the studies, I remember it was a scientist building an app to help or try and help folks with post-traumatic stress. I'm like, well, that's cool. And they're like, yeah, but I need to do this, this, and this. And I'm like, okay. The end result is we get the agreement in place. Now we're going to walk backwards. I'm going to tell you how long that this is going to take. Okay. Upwards to a year was the average timeline.
yeah. And
yeah. So, but
government jobs are interesting like that.
So, but then you leave, I leave, and later on I get a phone call from another contracting company who had picked it up, and they're like, "Hey, what would it take? How much money would we have to pay you to take this job?" And I'm like, "Well, okay, I don't need the benefits. It's a GS-12 position, so I need over 100K a year for me to sacrifice that much equity to go in and perform the job." And they're like, "No, we can't do that, because what the contractor does is they take the contractor gets the GS-12 money, and then they pay, or the contracting company will get the GS-12 money. They'll have to pay the benefits out of that. I didn't need them. And then they cut the person that takes the contract to do the work at like a 40 to 50% rate of what it actually pays. So they're just taking the difference in between, and that's their problem. So now you go to rehire that person. Well, you didn't look at, if you don't look at it in the view of complex systems and what that person is actually doing, walk around any organization, I forget the name of the rule and the law that applies to this. It's like 10% of the people do 90% of the work.
Yeah, and as the company grows, the disparity increases.
Yeah. So I'm fascinated about the company that are you still working with them?
Yeah, I still am, and they're still hugely successful.
So what that sounds like to me is a distributed autonomous organization. What you would see
that would be a good
on the blockchain. It's like, okay, you've got you do your part, I do my part. We exist on the blockchain to track everything that we're doing, and that way we have a solid record of it. And then we only get together when we need to.
Yeah, I really have to pester my boss to get him to respond. So one of the ways they just sort of tacitly keep track of are people actually working, because they have some people like me that are remote. They have their code base or their code repository on GitHub, and when you make commits, it shows up the next time you update your local. So they look and see, is Rich actually doing work? Oh yeah, he's got, 35 changes yesterday to this one module or something like that. And I think they just kind of like, oh yeah, so and so's working. And then if nobody did anything for a long time, then they would probably send me a text if I, say I went a week without pushing any code. What are you doing?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. They used to fly me down there once a month, and since we started this sort of policy, which is basically push code every day, they haven't really pestered me about it. So they still have ways of keeping track. I had about a dozen questions that you made me think of, and now they're all just flying out of my head.
They'll come back to you.
Yeah.
One of the cool things about that, and hopefully they're not tracking you to the point where, you got to push your changes. Hopefully they're not like, okay, you got to check in at 8, you got to log out at 4 or 6, and we want to see your out. I really like the Tim Ferriss point of view, which is, why am I going to pay you to sit at a desk 8 hours a day if you can possibly do your work in an hour?
Right.
And that was my situation. I'm like, why am I driving into this research center other than to walk around and tell scientists where they're at, where their agreement's at in the process of being approved? Leadership by walking around, Jack Welch, or communication by walking around. He was GE. Okay, General Electric, which started with Thomas Edison. Pretty good story.
Yeah. Spell image, then say light bulb.
IMAGE. Oh, light bulb. Got it. That's a dad joke. That's what that is.
My dad told me that joke.
So, but we get into this thing, and I would say it stems from the Thompsonism, which is you got to be here 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with that. Like, there's the meme that's out there. It's like, the guy comes in and he has to fix the engine on the ship, and he walks in with this little small tool bag, and he comes back 15 minutes later, and the engine's fixed, and he hands him the bill, and the guy's like, oh, the part $5. He's like showing up to, he's like, and then the other part of the bill, and I'm destroying the meme. It's put out better, but it's like the other part of the bill is $9,995, and he's like, what's that for? And he's like, knowing where to tap the hammer.
Yeah.
And so you pay someone, the moral is you pay someone for their experience, not necessarily for their time.
Yeah, my dad went out and fixed a garbage disposal one time, and the thing that was wrong with it was they hadn't plugged it in under the sink, and he charged him $125, and he itemized the bill that way, knowing to plug it in, $115, and plugging it in $10 or something like that.
Yeah. The question is, did he ever get called back to that residence?
Oh yeah,
that's good.
It was a builder who understood, the value of his knowledge, and they enjoyed the joke together, kind of a thing.
First customers are nice. Return customers are what builds the business.
I was listening to Derek Prince. You probably have never heard of him. He was kind of a leader in the discipleship movement when that was a thing, which nobody knows what that is either unless you Google it.
Okay.
But he's one of the most well-known for casting out demons. So he had a whole ministry that was about how to cast out demons, and they had a lot of interesting things happen in their church, and they saw a lot of miraculous things happen, people getting healed and stuff like that. And so people took it seriously. But one of the things that he said haunted me. And it's a kind of a complicated issue, but he said, if you've agreed to work 8 hours a day for a company and you spend 20 minutes talking to somebody, you've stolen 20 minutes from that company and you're a thief. And then you're going to be demon possessed basically and have curses on you and all this stuff. And it was like, oh my gosh, is it true? And so I had this period where I was trying to make up for lost time because I'd had those conversations with people, and yeah, it was just this horror. I ended up having this nightmare about it where it's like the concept manifested in this nightmare. And in the nightmare, I get into the ring with this opponent that is gigantic And somehow I get the impression that his name is like Kronos or something, which is time.
Right.
And I realize I will never be able to defeat this opponent.
Nope.
It's a hopeless battle. And so instead of defeating the opponent, I think it's like I offered him a cup of tea and we got out of the ring and we sat together and enjoyed our tea, and that's how I won the battle. And it was something like that, this really weird nightmare. And then I came across the concept of Old Covenant versus New Covenant, which Old Covenant is the letter of the law. This is what the code is. You must do these things.
Yep.
Which is related to the idea of jumping through hoops or authoritarian government or
Push code every day.
something like that. Which there are days when I don't push code, and if they brought it up, I would say, well, my code was at a state that if I pushed it, it would shut down the company, so I decided to wait till the next day.
Okay.
And they would understand that. And anybody who does software development should understand that concept.
Get it?
Yeah. If you have a syntax error, then the whole system doesn't load correctly. And so all of the machines stop working. And syntax errors are things like I go to push and I accidentally bumped the space bar or a number key and created a variable by accident that had like an extra letter in it that doesn't exist, or I put a space, whatever. You can accidentally cause a syntax error by bumping the keyboard and then shut down your whole database or whatever your code base.
Yeah, not good.
Yeah. So you want to test and double check, and if the kids are screaming and it's 5 o'clock and it's going to take another 3 hours before I can push this code, then you do it tomorrow. And so it's kind of, when I signed the contract to work for this company, they expressed this concept to me. They're like, yeah, technically you've agreed to work X number of hours, but it's more about the job or the project. We want to get things done that are helpful to the company. So, and the boss says, and I know you're going to be thinking about this code when you're trying to sleep at night and on the weekends, and as far as I'm concerned, anytime it's rattling around in your head, you're technically working.
Yes.
Which may not have been the best way to describe this concept of spirit of the law versus letter of the law.
Right.
But it's along those lines. So I had to come to grips with the spirit behind what we're doing here is let's get these problems solved. And if we're actually not benefiting the company by sticking to a 9-hour a day schedule or something like that. So if I come to like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and my brain is completely fried and I'm not being productive, I'm not going to just sit there because of the letter of the law says I have to be there for another hour and stare at the screen and waste time. If I could, go and take a nap and then in 15 minutes solve this problem, that's a lot better use of my time. It's actually better for the company and, that kind of thing. So, yeah, just that whole concept of...
We are seeing that shift. In fact, one of the books I just finished was the Exponential Age, and he talks about that. And he's like, we're getting to the point where your knowledge worker, okay, which is what you are, you're a knowledge worker. You are going to have more leeway, and you do have more leeway because you're creating in your mind the code to keep the company running or accomplishing the mission that it's doing. And that's a creative process. And it's a lot of people. I read a quote about one artist the other day. I think it was from Anti-Fragile, and the guy's talking about, he's like, the canvas does 50% of the work. He's like, my 50% is showing up and putting the first brush stroke on there and then seeing where we go from there. And sidebar, one of the most fascinating paintings I've ever looked at was a single brush stroke. I stood, it was in this gentleman's apartment in San Francisco, and I stood and looked, and every time I would walk by that painting, I would stop and look at it again for like periods of time, like not just seconds, for like 1-2 minutes, just looking, because it just drew me in, and it was one brush stroke. And then the owner of the painting walks over and he's talking to me. He's like, yeah, you know, I was there when the artist did that. He said, the brushstroke's important. He said, what was more important was getting the canvas prepared to take the brushstroke so he could do it. But so knowledge worker creative, it's a process.
Yeah.
Whereas compare that to a warehouse worker. Okay, now we're back to
assembly line or something like
yeah,
that.
now we're back to Thompsonism. How many widgets can you? So the you know, a great example of where that is that's Amazon trying to automate as much as they can in their warehouses to be able to, you know, have that online purchasing process basically be, I mean, it is real, but almost to the point where like I'm pulling the product off the shelf and now it's here. Like it's click and it's like, okay, I'm cool. It's going to be here in 6 hours.
Yeah,
or
you know,
4 hours.
The whole concept of my job in any developer is automation. And I worked at an architectural company where they used software that was kind of dying. Some people might argue that it's still viable, but they were using 3D Studio Max for modeling and animations and stuff like that. And it worked, but it had a lot of issues. And one of the issues is that they were riding on their reputation as being like the standard, and so they weren't developing as fast as some of the other 3D software was developing. And so they had one guy there whose job description was basically to create processes and procedures. So like if we're going to go through a 3D model of a roadway and convert the triangles into quads, so a polygon that has 3 sides versus a polygon that has 4 sides. And the reason that you would do that is because the rendering software can model the shading more accurately on a 4-sided polygon than it can on a 3-sided polygon. So this person whose, you know, existence was justified by practices and procedures came up with a method. You go in and you identify which of the lines that makes the triangle should be deleted so that you can convert it into a polygon, and then you go through this process and you do that. Well, doing the same task over and over and over again, if you're a developer, that's like, are you insane?
Chinese
We
water.
have the ability to write code. What?
Chinese water torture.
Yeah. So I knew an algorithm that already did this more efficiently than a person can do it, because it's something that's really easy to define mathematically. You know, which line should we get rid of in order to make this a square? And so they said, this should keep you busy till tomorrow. I'm going, okay. So I
Sophie, down.
I exported the whole model to this other software, ran the algorithm, and brought it back. And 15 minutes later, they show up with their lunches. They're like, you got that figured out? I'm like, yeah, it's done. What do you mean it's done? So then there's all this suspicion and all this whispering, and let me look at that model, and they're going through it, and you clearly did not do this the way that I said to do it. Well, is it okay? Does it look okay? Going through all the, you know, squares and looking at them. Well, I don't have time to go through all of this, and he deletes it. Do it the way that I told you to do it. So it's like, okay, I'm going to sit here, you know, for the next 8 hours, or, you know, basically tomorrow afternoon, to have this in the state that I just had it at. Why? Just because we have practices and procedures, process. This is the way that we do things. Okay, should we be doing these things these way? Well, you're not in that position to be asking that question. And so then it goes to the big boss, and I told him the situation. And the big boss, well, he hired me because he knew I was that kind of person.
Right.
So he basically says, just do what you need to do. I'll deal with management. And so now this guy hates me, and, you know, he glares at me when I walk by, because this is his title. This is what justifies his existence. And I, I'm talking about this because I see similar things happening in so many places in the relationship between my wife and I and how we parent and how we can counsel our daughter in terms of why are grades important. And there's a lot of jumping through hoops involved in the school system. And do we really want to train somebody to be a good assembly line worker,
Mm-hmm.
or do we want to train them to be able to think outside the box? It's like, well, the school system is great if you're going to go and work at a factory. School
Yeah.
system is not so great if you're going to be an entrepreneur. So,
But you can go to class or you go to college and take a class in entrepreneurship. And I was speaking with a gentleman a couple weeks ago, very successful businessman, has in the crypto world put together a team that created a stable coin, a very well-known stable coin. Okay. And multimillionaire, like hundreds of million dollars, might even be a billionaire. I don't know. And how I ended up getting to meet him, a friend's texted me and he's like, hey, and I'm being vague here because I don't want to let their names out.
yeah.
So, and he's like, hey, do you want to sit down with so and so? And I'm like, okay, why are we meeting? Why are we doing this? And he's like 15 minutes, just take the meeting. And he's like, we'll do it at the cafe by the lake, the one on the east side, over by the golf course area where they just built our new condos. I'm like, okay, cool. That's 10-minute walk from where I live. Sure. And of course, it's a day where it's just dumping snow. Like we got 10 inches of snow that day. It's just dumping. So I'm not thinking about this guy. I'm just like, we're going to go meet him. That's cool. Throw on my galoshes over my sneakers because it's just more comfortable. Like, don't even put snow boots on. I don't even have snow boots. So I throw my galoshes on, walk over there. And it wasn't cold. So I'm just wearing, like my fleece with my rain suit over the top of it. Show up and meet this guy. And he looks at me. He's like, I don't know why we're meeting. I was like, I don't know why we're meeting either. And my buddy's sitting there just kind of chuckling because he knows. He's like, they'll figure it out. And so I'm like, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. How'd you get started in business? What are you doing? What you do? And he's like, well, I just been lucky a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Call a timeout when you meet somebody that's extremely wealthy and says they get lucky a lot. They don't get lucky a lot.
You don't think so?
No, they're emotionally intelligent and can figure out how to put together the teams of right people around them that they need to accomplish what they are trying to do.
See, my brother-in-law, he's a jet pilot and he's also a Bitcoin evangelist, and he got in early, so
yeah, so he's a mega evangelist.
yeah, and he will occasionally just pop off with something like, well, yeah, I had like 500K in that currency or something. I don't know what it's doing right now. It just throws around this kind of money
right
like it's nothing. And he says, I've been talking to all of these multimillionaire type people as I'm flying them around to these different places, and they're idiots. He says so many of these people are just complete morons. And he, in all of his meeting of these types of people, he came to the exact opposite conclusion you just said. He says it's totally luck. Luck is 99.9% of it.
The ones that I've watched and the few that I've met
Yeah.
understand the importance of team. Now, I have also met people that have been part of unicorns.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a unicorn startup. They went in, they figured out a process. They killed themselves for 2 or 3 years. They did the typical start a unicorn and basically a unicorn and sell it, take the profits. And then when they get done with that, like they killed themselves for 3 years and they're like, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And they're, I have met one who's in the process of reassembling a team and moving forward into what I would say a very nebulous and evolving area, which is Web 3.0 communities and organizing online and then trying to take that organization online and push it back out into the real world, which is fascinating. So, but meeting with this gentleman, he was like, I started this company and I started helping college students understand business because the business programs they were going to in college weren't teaching them what they needed to know. So in other words, giving them the practical hands-on experience. And he's like, I stopped doing that roughly right around, I'm going to say 2011, because he's like, all of a sudden I had students showing up saying, well, you owe me. And this guy's meritocracy based. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I didn't have anything handed to me. He's like, I went out and started this business. I found a a niche, or I found an area in the market that needed help. I found out how to bring college students in. I did it, grew it to a multi-million-dollar company, sold the company, took that money, started another company. But he's really good at finding the right people. And I'll be like, so I'll talk to him. I'm like, okay, on the stable coin, what do you think about this? He's like, I don't know. He's like, I'm not the expert on that. He's like, you would go and talk to this person. And on his legal team, so one of the things he did, and I read about this group 2 or 3 years ago, there was a group of cryptocurrency lawyers out of Chicago that were getting together to figure out how would one regulate the cryptocurrency industry, what laws need to be, what regulations need to get put in place. Okay, perfect capitalism doesn't exist. There has to be some regulations. So he finds that team. They're on his team. He finds like his research assistant, my friend, is a PhD level research assistant. One of the issues I run into when I interact with this gentleman is he literally thinks too much. He's like me. He's like, we got all this information. Like, what the heck do we do with it? So, but he's not lucky. He knows how to select good teams of people, and it's very similar to, I would say, a Jack Welch. He gets pulled in to fix GE. How does he do it? He walks around and he talks to people, because leadership is relational. So your leadership team is different. They're all code based. In general, engineers are not talkative people.
Right.
They're also not people. They like, this is the process and this is how I told you to do
there's,
it.
There's basically a spectrum from one side to the other, and that spectrum is most obvious in the sexes. Women tend to be more people focused, and men tend to be more thing focused. Statistically, which is why I go to a big international software conference and there's 300 guys and 2 women.
Exactly.
That's just the way that we're wired, and you're actually wired more towards the people, from what you said earlier.
Well, that comes from healthcare.
Or it might be why you were drawn to healthcare.
I do have a strong empathetic portion of me, in that I struggle with things like, I was in Burma. I saw a guy essentially get his foot crushed, his ankle crushed, and pretty much chopped off when it got rear-ended in just a little rear-end accident. And so they're developing nation, third world country, people just hang off of vehicles and they'll stand on the bumpers. Well, if there's an accident, another vehicle rear-ends it. I mean, they're still driving the Jeeps and the trucks that we gave them from World War II. Burmese, the people in Myanmar, in Rangoon, at night, they don't have a tendency not to drive with their headlights on, at least when I was there, which is over 20 years ago, because it uses up the battery on the vehicle, which uses up the alternator, so they just don't use their lights. It's really interesting. But,
so,
when I see that happen, it's like, I wasn't in a position to act because it would have been an international incident. And they specifically tell you, I was guarding embassies as a Marine, like, if you see that, don't do anything, because it'll be an international incident if you do the wrong things. You pretty much have to walk away, which sucks, because, and then you walk by people on the street and it's like, there's a homeless guy sitting there, and I know that there's a brain and a heart, and I know there's this personality inside this body, but this person is sitting on the side of the road in this state of whatever, most likely related to some type of psychosis, and want to help them and can't do it. So,
well, and the reason that we can't help those people is because of fear. And I worked at a bike shop. I was in Washington D.C. area, and in D.C. area, any big city really, there's this absolute terror of being sued. And so somebody would come in and they'd want some really stupid little fix on a bike that's literally going to take me a minute and a half, and I would just do it and get out of here, you're fine, that kind of thing. And the management would have a heart attack if they saw me doing something like that. It's like, you didn't fill out the proper forms, you didn't, because what if that person goes out and crashes a bike and we get sued? It's like, that fear that prevents us from doing good things I don't know how to break away from that. And I wonder this whole thing where you've got this country that they're still driving these World War II vehicles. Why is that? Is there an ideology that started years before that's just permeated the entire culture, and now they're permanently stuck being this backwards third world country because of their philosophy or the ideology that governs the whole culture, or why is that?
Military dictatorship. So Myanmar, Burma, whichever name you want to use, it's I think the single most diverse country in Southeast Asia. There's over 100, upwards of 130 different ethnic groups. And I haven't read all the documents because we used to, as a Marine security guard, you go around and scan the embassy for classified documents that had been left out, confiscate them, write them a citation, lock them in the safe down on post one. But at the same time, while you're investigating somebody's desk, they also leave all their research out, so you get to read it if you want to. So there's over 130 different ethnic groups in Burma. The biggest thing that drives disagreement is tribal. That's like, look at Iraq. And that drives massive disagreements. So they were a military dictatorship. I can't remember for how many years. I do remember we lived next door to Aung San Suu Kyi, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And we lived right next door to her, and she was under house arrest. And which is interesting. And I think she ends up getting elected. I think she was elected for a third time. And during the time that she was elected for the third time was when they had their ethnic cleansing movement, which is like, how do you get the Peace Prize, become president of a nation, and then have an ethnic cleansing movement?
Well, it might have been more peaceful afterwards.
Well, yeah, it can be, but that's the struggle. That's what Talib, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Nassim Nicholas Taleb or Taleb, is talking about an anti-fragile. Is like you go from these like a communist state where everything's controlled, right? And there's no fluctuation. It's just like, look at the architecture. It's all the same. Look at the bridges. They're all the same. One of the reasons they struggled with depression in the old Soviet Union was because everything was the same. It was gray. There was no art. There was no architecture. Turns out we need that. Our brains crave that creativity. You writing code, your brain actually likes doing that and solving the problems.
Yeah, there was actually some study that I read where they had a bunch of teams of people, developers or whatever, and they had some way of rating the productivity, and they experimented with like putting paintings and potted plants and artwork and stuff, and the morale and the productivity it went up. There was absolutely no misunderstanding the data. It just flat out made a huge difference to put artwork in people's cubicles.
So when we're looking at that, and this is what Taleb will talk about, or Taleb will talk about, and talks about an anti-fragile, is that in a communist state, it's pretty much just flatline. There's no fluctuation.
Yeah.
There's no oscillation. So there's no, like stock market's up today, it's down tomorrow. So you don't have to account for it. But what happens is when one or a few things change in what communism, I would say, is a fragile system. So let's say there's a supply side shortage and you can't feed your people because something broke. Okay, that's going to have a tendency to destroy the whole system. Where in a capitalistic system, in a free society, it's like, okay, well, we can move resources from here and here and here. Like entrepreneurs are going to come in and solve the problem. It's like my son was talking about, like, hey, Dad, do they have Oreos down in Antarctica? And I'm like, I'm willing to bet some enterprising entrepreneur has put Oreos on the supply ferry to the Antarctic stations. And I'm willing to bet that they are extremely expensive. So, but the more we try and smooth things out, which is we're having a tendency to do that in society, the more we try and smooth things out and make it easier, the more we make ourselves fragile.
Yeah, well, it would depend on your approach, I imagine. And there really is there's these two diametrically opposing ways of doing, I guess, everything that manifest in authority structures. And the one method is gaslighting, which is we have the figureheads, the gatekeepers of what everybody's supposed to think and do, and etc. And they're the experts. So if you question what they're saying, it's because you don't understand and you need to be put out of the group, and and in order to enforce their superiority in making all decisions, doing all the thinking, you have things like creeds and codices, and they, I believe, are intentionally filled with information that is completely meaningless, because if I make just a crazy statement, carpal flansibles are highly traculate. You must believe this in order to be part of our group. Do you affirm this? Well, yeah, I affirm that. Do you understand it? Well, no, but I don't need to, because the person who's in charge understands it. So those kinds of things, and you'll see those in religious creeds all the time, these statements that have no meaning. You have to swear loyalty to the statement. And that way we can pretend like we're being governed by, like a system, rather than governed by a person who represents that system. And so you have the gaslighting and the control that goes into that.
Fascinating, but let's extrapolate that into other book I'm reading, Surveillance Capitalism, and that is the user agreement. When you click on it, it is the code that you are agreeing to. For supplying them with your information, they get to do X, Y, and, well, multiply X, Y, and Z out to what they can do with it. You're agreeing to have information extracted from you. I can't remember the man hours it would take, or the hours it would take to read all of the user agreements, but it was, I think, the calculated cost that I just read a couple of days ago came out to be like over $800 billion. That's in the age of surveillance.
In time lost.
Time loss. It's in the age of surveillance capitalism. It's Shoshana Zuboff is writing, a really good writer, fabulous book. But we don't do that. We just click through.
Yeah, I never read those things.
Yeah, well, you can't, but it creates a very similar situation where we have given the control. Here's the example of mass hysteria psychosis.
Mass formation psychosis or whatever.
It's
I was reading about
Robert Monroe. I think it's Robert Monroe was one of the co-inventors of mRNA vaccine technology. I found his video on YouTube on mass hysteria psychosis, and there's still some on there with interviews that he's given with other people other than Joe Rogan. And he had he actually put together an hour-long video for YouTube on mass hysteria psychosis, where it's just him walking people through it. I found that like 2 months ago. Joe Rogan goes and interviews him, and because Joe Rogan has like 300 million followers or something like that, it blows up Google. They literally went in and pulled the definition down and rewrote it to put it back out, to put it back out there. And it's gone from the point of just taking what's called what is it called? It's gone from, well, it is a form of extraction, but it's gone from basically the surplus from what we put into Google. So our behavioral surplus, like things that we click on, so on and so forth, fed their algorithms, which looped it back, created AdWords, all that good stuff. But it creates this situation where they now have gone from not just extracting information, okay, and I don't know if Zuboff gets to this point later on in the book, but it's gone from just not just extracting information to now a control of it, where now, look at how we say, well, just Google it.
Yeah.
Like, when did Google become a verb? Okay, just Google it, and we look it up. But Google is the controlling source of that information, and Google can change the definition of it, which further people would say in The Sovereign Individual, the authors write about this. Their prediction was that the internet would lead to further democratization because each individual will be allowed to be themselves. What they missed is what Mark Blythe talks about with entrainment. And he wasn't the one that discovered the concept of entrainment. It comes out of biology, but it's why fish swim in schools, deer, or buffalo are going to be in a herd. But we entrain ourselves, and human beings do this. We select the group that we want to hang out in. QAnon's a great example of that.
Yeah.
Okay, go hang out in your group and
Flat earthers,
and just get reinforced. You are now entrained into that mindset. You just mentioned a Calvinist that managed to break themselves out of that mindset. What has to happen is essentially what has to happen is that metronome has to stop for them. There has to be something that goes in and messes with that metronome within the group, because in entrainment, it's like seaweed in the ocean currents. It's like you're all swaying together.
Yeah,
Okay?
and that's fine, except that the group might actually be headed off a cliff. And
Exactly.
I think a lot of these groups, ideological groups, are headed off of a cliff, and a lot of these groups are, well, because of just the way that the phenomenon of mass psychosis, mass formation psychosis, or whatever.
Yeah.
that
Mass
might be-
formation psychosis.
Yeah, the way that it works, you end up having some figurehead that is entrusted with all of the direction and all the thinking and for these groups. Where was I going with this? I'm brain dead this morning.
Yeah, happens.
If the fragility of this system, it's going to go off a cliff. If, like, you take the Mars Hill Church, for example. Mark Driscoll, I think, was the
Yeah, actually know somebody that knows that group.
Yeah, one of the
Was
largest,
like right next door to them when all this was happening.
Yeah, the largest church in all of Seattle area, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all following this one guy and his ideology. And so when scandal erupts and he gets caught, in plagiarism and all this stuff, then
What pastor doesn't plagiarize?
right, but hundreds of thousands of dollars were exchanged for data that was plagiarized and
Okay.
different things.
Got it.
It became important enough that there were legal things that happened, and I don't remember all the details, but there was also a lot of issues with things that he said on Facebook that were just abominable, derogatory things about women, which I wouldn't repeat on this,
Right.
recording, and pornography showing up in the hymnals at the church and stuff like that. He was a man with very high libido, and he worked that into his theology. Let's just say that. Anyway, so when the system, or when he collapsed, the whole system collapsed and the church completely shut down. So you got all these people who were like, what do we do now? It's incredibly fragile. The same thing with like Willow Creek Church. It's all about this guy, Bill Hybels, right? And then out of nowhere, like 6 different women, something like that, all these women come forward and have these stories of abuse, sexual abuse. And so then he gets taken out, and now that church is in chaos. And this story repeats itself over and over again. And, it's really obvious in churches. It's easy to pick on. But it would happen with anything that's a tribal group or a mass psychosis that all centers around like this one individual. And I think the founding fathers were aware of this cycle, and they were trying to come up with a system of checks and balances that would keep it more like decentralized to theoretically prevent this from happening and causing the whole country to collapse. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? What is the solution to mass psychosis or preventative measures?
It's open-mindedness. So the Mars Hill situation is fascinating, but it also ties into a very simple thing that I used to teach my sailors. That's a very simple story, or a very simple explanation. That is, let's say you're a second-class petty officer, and you're my leading petty officer. So you basically take care of everything in the battalion aid station. You're running it. You and I talk on a daily basis, but it's your ship to run. You take care of it. I handle the higher interactions with the sergeant major, the commanding officer, the battalion executive officer, so on and so forth. Occasionally interact with a company or a battery commander, but it's your ship and you run it. You come into my office and and I'm like, hey, Rich, here's what's going on for the day, or here's what's going on for the week or the month. This is what we need to get done. This is where I think we need to focus. I get your input. We adjust. You get your plan. You walk out the door. Okay, you get your tasking. If you walk out that door and you look at your sailors and you say, the chief says we need to do X, Y, and Z, you have just diminished yourself. You're not acting on your authority as a second class petty officer, as my leading petty officer. You're acting on my authority as a chief. And when you do that, I might as well come out and do your job for you, because you're not offering your own input and putting your own ownership on top of that. Because undoubtedly you're going to have the young HN or the E3, E4, or E5 that may push back on you and say, hey, I want to do it this way. Okay, well, that's going to create some limbic friction for you. That's going to create some uncomfortableness, because you may be like, well, if this doesn't get done right, this doesn't get properly, chief may decide to chew my backside or make me feel a little uncomfortable about the results. I'm a coach as a leader. So generally it's going to come in and say, hey, you did the following things right. I always start with the positive. These are areas we need to improve on. If you really stepped in it and did something that violates or treads on integrity, my voice is probably going to go up, depending on the severity of it. But then go back but you got to own it. Okay. And then I'm pretty sure Jack Welch would talks about that as well. So in what you're doing, the goal of a really good leader is not to control everything. It may sound a little arrogant, but I want a bunch of little, Chief Smiths out there running around going, I know how to do this because my chief showed me how to do it, and I'm completely capable of handling this. But they also know if they get stuck, they can come and knock on the door to the LPO's office, or if they're, come and talk to me. They're like, hey, chief, here's what I'm facing. Okay. And you give them a little insight, but they own it. It's not, chief says we got to do it, so we got to do it. Because then when they're at that level, they're focused on making the chief happy, and they're not focused on the entire organization and what happens.
Yeah.
Okay. So
a good leader is going to be empowering the people
absolutely
that are under them, as opposed to enslaving them.
Exactly.
You're going to equip them to think for themselves so they don't need you, or you could be the insecure leader who needs people to follow them
and then think about this. You'll run into a lot of leaders and they'll say, okay, it's my job to protect my people. To a certain extent, yes. If in a school situation, if you raise a hand to my child and I'm not there, I'm going to go protect my child, and I'm going to be angry with you. Okay, to a certain extent. But my job as a parent and my job as a leader in the Navy is not to protect my sailors. That makes them very fragile. My job is to challenge them. Okay, my job is to say, when they walk into my office, and if you're a chief and you don't do this, and my sailors, every chief does this, and sailors get sick of hearing it. They walk into your office and they're like, hey, chief, I want to do X, Y, and Z. Awesome. What's the instruction say? There's an instruction for this. So for Battalion Aid Station, it's going to be the Bureau of Medicine 6100 or 6000 series. Will have, they're pretty sure it's 6000. It's going to have the whole layout of how to run a battalion aid station. So if I hand you a commodities area, let's say you're taking care of the physical exams that are required for Marines once every 5 years or upon reenlistment, so on and so forth. There are special exams in there. Let's say I hand that to you. My expectation is when I give you that commodity area, you're going to go read the instruction that pertains to physical exams and become the expert on that. After you do that for 6 months to a year, we're going to rotate you into another commodity area. Maybe you'll do immunizations. Touchy subject, I know, with COVID, but maybe you take care of immunizations, which is a huge portion of preventive medicine, which is occupational health, so on and so forth. Another instruction that you have to go learn. All this is also going to be on your exam that you take every 6 months. Plus, you need to know this when you're sitting in my chair as the chief running the battalion aid station. So your you're not, I don't think you're doing your sailors any favors when you're protecting them.
Yeah.
Shorter story. I was at Naval Medical Center San Diego for less than a year, and they gave me, I was in charge, or I was the senior enlisted for the intensive care unit and the cardiac intensive care unit. And my commanders would always freak out because the chiefs would get together every couple of months and reshuffle the staff. And they're like, I don't want to lose so and so. I don't want to blah 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 blah. I'm like, I'm usually working with female nurses, and I'll be like, ma'am, that's because you're comfortable with them, and you don't want to get the new person because you're afraid that there's going to be some setbacks and there's going to be some friction. And here's a newsflash: there's going to be some setbacks and some friction, but you need to bring in a new sailor so they can learn a new role and so that they can grow. We're fragile because let's say we just lose that LPO, that leading petty officer to begin with. Who takes their place? If they haven't trained anyone else, it's a huge gap. It's one of the reasons that the Marines, like, you got to know how to operate all your weapons systems.
So our country right now is engaged in this mass psychosis. These churches are engaged in a mass psychosis, and they're about ready to fall off a cliff because that's how it always ends. So it's an important question: what's going on here? How do we avoid catastrophe? There are several things that seem to be common. Laziness, I would say, is a big problem. People don't want to do the research themselves. When I went to Moody Bible Institute, and I'm hearing contradictions from the professors, ideological, philosophical, and doctrinal contradictions. I'm going, this guy says this other guy says this. Does anybody recognize that these things are contradictory and maybe there's some discontinuity even within the system?
Yeah.
And it ended with me just distrusting them. And I was talking to one professor about this, and I said, you've got like this, for example, your doctrinal statement. Well, where do you get these ideas? Why do you think that this is true? Why? I said, this is purportedly going to affect whether a person spends all of eternity in hell or all of eternity in heaven. It might be an important question, assuming you accept a lot of the presuppositions that are already in place here, that going to heaven or going to hell is based on which doctrines you sign your name to. But I suppose that's another issue. Anyway, so I said
it's not up to me. I don't make that decision. That's why I'm not an apologist.
Yeah, well, and having done a lot of research now, I can point at facts and data related to this question and say, this is not me. This is something that I can point at. Here, look and see. And I think that that's really what you want to get down to, is the stuff that we can actually point at. And a good teacher is one who can point and who can demonstrate, and who is not saying, you trust me, I'm the authority, but who is saying, look over there.
Well, look at, in a completely different realm, look at Plato and Aristotle. Okay. So Aristotle spends 20 years with Plato, and Plato's not sitting there the whole time going like, yeah, dude, read this chapter, write a report. And Plato's Academy was set up where Plato was walking around talking to the various students that were there that were studying things, and then they would get together and they'd talk about it.
Yeah.
And then be like, okay, well, what's going on here? And I said, what is he talking about when he's like, the form of the good, or the good form, or what is the good form? What is the use of all this philosophy? Is it to be, they would say a philosopher should be a politician. That's a good thing for a philosopher to be. You should be a philosopher king. So that's, in my opinion, that's dead in America. There's a couple of private colleges out there that don't take any federal funding that will still teach at that level. But I also worry about the person that pushes back on it. And they're saying like, no, do this because X, Y, and Z. It's kind of like we watched the Dead Poets Society. And it's like the professors here, like, he's like, we're not here to teach them really anything new. We're here to teach them discipline so they can go get into the good schools, so they can go get the good jobs or do whatever. And it's like, oh no, we need to be able to think. And so going all the way back to the founding fathers, okay, let's think about a few of them. One, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin, considered one of the greatest, the term that comes to mind is autodidact, but it's another term essentially for a person that has many skills and works in many different areas. I can't think of the term right now.
Renaissance man, maybe?
It is, thank you. So considered one of the seven, if you Google it, hate to use that term, if you look it up and you search it, he's considered one of the 7 great Renaissance men of all times. Created the lightning rod, conducted experiments with electricity, was the guy that gets credit for creating the library, except he charged a fee for gaining access to the books. Why? Because books weren't prevalent at that time. They were becoming more prevalent because of the Gutenberg printing press and then the adaptations we made on top of that. But the first job Benjamin Franklin has is a printer after he moves from Boston to Philadelphia. There really wasn't a lot of people in Philadelphia at that time. Starts a printing press, writes the Silence Do-Good letters, has all these different pseudonyms that he works under, gets interested in politics. What he really wanted to be was the postmaster general for the area. That didn't work out for him. But then goes on to be an envoy to be for France, and he's the guy that secures the funding for the revolution, one of the key moments in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, you know, there's
no formal degree. But now also take Sam Adams. Sam Adams, no formal degree. The greatest agitator leader in Boston, in my opinion, and was considered probably the leader of the founding fathers.
Have you ever heard this? And this happens to me all the time because I think my success is related to this issue. In fact, my daughter this morning, she's like, "So you're what people would call a really successful person, right? You know, you've spoke at these conferences and you've done this and that, and you have this amazing job, and you've created these, you know." And she says, "You know, what would you say is the reason for your success?" And I'm trying to condense it down to something that is like a take home. And it's that conversation where somebody tells me, people who are much smarter than you have already tried to understand this. You really think that you were going to figure it out?
That's awesome.
Yep.
I love
so that
that.
was one of the first things in Bible college. It's what I started to talk about, where I'm saying to my professors, how do we know these guys are right? And because I don't know if they're right, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom level and see how they came to their conclusions. And it was like, no, don't do that. You know, no, you need to read the writings of this guy. And if you're going to try to go that route and go all the way down, that is so inefficient. These people have done all this work to get to this point, and you want to start all the way back down here. You're going to be wasting so much time. And of course, the problem there is, if we reword what you're saying you need to assume that all of our specific doctrines at this college are correct and work from there. Well, what if we go over to the college next door that thinks that you're wrong about everything? You know, what if I want to decide which college I should even be a part of? And Calvinism, and Moody Bible happens to be entirely Calvinist, it has this really cool way of basically stopping you from thinking any deeper than the landing on, here's the stuff that you must believe in order to continue being a Calvinist. They call it presuppositionalism.
Yeah.
And presuppositionalism is that stuff that we believe without bothering to ask why we believe it. This stuff is above scrutiny. Well, how do we know? By presuppositionalism. So which things do we put into that category? Yes, it's a big circle. You can't question that. Of course, all these logical fallacies start emerging if you start talking to these people about it. And the famous one is divine mystery, which divine mystery, it has attached to it that sense that you think you can understand this. Well, what kind of an arrogant, I want to throw in an expletive. What kind of arrogant person do you think you are that you'll be able to understand this thing that the greats haven't understood? And you think you're smarter than the whole college, and you think that. So you start getting these threats and personal attacks when you start, implying that maybe you could understand this. And you'll hear people using the divine mystery plea in a really arrogant way, where they'll say, well, yeah, I realize that, this idea that I just said and this idea are blatant A equals A and not A at the same time contradictions, but this is something that comes from God, and I understand that I have a puny intellect and I'll never be able to understand this. Are you saying that you're smarter than God? And so it's like you have this insulting braggart sort of way of talking about the limitations of your understanding. And it's all really just a big smokescreen to defend the cognitive dissonance. So that idea, though, you really think you're going to be able to solve this problem? There are PhDs at Harvard who don't understand this. I've come up against those things multiple times in my career and said, yeah, sure, why not? And then solved it, and then, made these, and that's why I get invited to speak at these big things and, whatever. It's because it's like I just lack that one little thing that's part of normalcy, which is this sense that smarter people have tried to understand this. What makes you think you can?
Oh, dude, you just opened up a big box on that. So when you talk about normalcy, I think we all have. There's a phrase in medicine that says within normal limits.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you walk into a room and you tell me that you just did a knee exam on somebody and it came back normal, I'd be like, okay, what's normal?
Yeah.
Standard deviation plus or minus 5%. Still got to work on that equation, but anyway, it's like, okay, because each individual's unique. What I'm thinking of when you talk about when you're sharing that story is one of my favorite movies, which is Hidden Figures, and the director who's over the room, and they're trying to figure out how to bring a spaceship back down and land it, trying to figure out the coordinates and how to calculate the coordinates. And he looks at his assistant and he says, you know what your job is? And I think his assistant's name is Paul. He's like, you know what your job is, Paul? Paul looks at him and he's all quizzical, because, and I'll drop those questions out and you get the weird look. And I'm like, you know what your job is? And they're like, and he's like, your job is to find the genius among those geniuses. Okay. And that stuck with me because you'll run into people. It's like, okay, there were PhDs that had to approve the PhD of Richard Feynman. All he did was go on to be like one of the experts at Los Alamos and during the Manhattan Project, one of the youngest people there. But what Feynman was noted for is doing what you did, going back to first principles.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons that people have a tendency not to go back to first principles, in my opinion, is what's called the law of least effort. If it's already been calculated, so like I don't need to go back in and take apart the equation for standard deviation. And some people will probably chuckle and be like, what, you can't understand that? Blah, 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 blah. No, I don't really grasp it right now. I struggle with three-dimensional stuff and I struggle in math sometimes. Don't know why, just is there. So it just takes me a while to get through it, but I guarantee when I understand it. But going back to first principles and looking at it from a first principles perspective, which is what you did when your biblical studies, which is fascinating because that 3-hour conversation we had on that. And it's fascinating. But the law of least effort will be like, well, that's already done.
Yeah.
Okay. Plus they're trying to bring you into the brood, which if you're essentially it's advertising and marketing. You want people to buy your product because that tells you that you're successful.
In the developer's world, I have this conversation more than any other developer that I've ever had, and it's probably because this idea of going back to first principles has been really solidified in me by seeing what happened with these different religious movements. And, it happens in business, and it happens in every tribal system. And it happens in anytime there's a breakthrough in technology, you've got somebody who has questioned the existing standards. We hired a guy at Gerber who, PhD in physics, to come in and make improvements on the physics engine. And he was talking about his favorite algorithm for rotation of a single vector, and he showed it to me. And it's the standard way of rotating a vector where it it has like a matrix, and there's cosines in there, and there's a bunch of solves, and then you can rotate the vector over. And I said, what is this doing exactly? And he's like, well, it takes this vector here and rotates it over so that it matches this vector over here. Okay, so what's the difference between these two vectors? They have different lengths and they're pointing in different directions. So what if you took this length and put it on this one? Now you've got it rotated, and you've had to do two distance calculations as opposed to this big rotation matrix. Wouldn't that be computationally less expensive? And so then there's this jaw drop moment where he's like, but you're supposed to, but.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn from school. I learned from having a computer in front of me and, YouTube and Google, and then a lot of like, what does this math do if I type in this? Let's see what it, and it's like, oh, hey, and so I was taught from the basis of having like zero knowledge by just experimenting. And yeah. I've done that with pretty much everything. Just don't take anything for granted. Anytime you hear, but you're supposed to, my ears perk up. Who's doing the supposing here?
Yeah.
Who made that supposition?
What I call a teeth sucker. And you go, ooh. Yeah.
Yeah. When I first got hired at Gerber, I had done a lot of 3D graphics stuff, which through the software, you learn the user interface and you know which buttons to click, and it's like using Photoshop or something like that. You're not writing code. And I could see things were starting to get weird at my current job, and so I started sort of looking in other places. And there was this job as a programmer. It was a programming job. I'd never done any writing of programming. So I asked if I could use my training time to learn some basic programming skills, and they were in between projects, and so they're like, sure. So I had a week. So I did a week's worth of tutorials, and then I flew to Connecticut and interviewed for a job as a programmer. And I was completely upfront about everything. It's like, I'm not really a programmer, but I understand a lot of things that are going on here, and I did some demonstrations of things that I'd done, and they're like, okay, well, you can learn the programming. So I get this job as a programmer. I move to Connecticut. They pay for all the expenses and everything. And I immediately start writing code. Within 3 months, I had a working physics engine. And the guys that were, right out of college, got jobs in programming, the senior programmers there, everybody was arguing about like which cloth physics engine to use for their new 3D product. Should we do this one? Should we do, it's like the Havoc engine is in Unity, and the Unreal has this engine over here, and NVIDIA's doing this experimental stuff here, and they're trying to figure, and I'm just going, we have very specific needs. Why don't we just write our own? They're like, oh, you have no idea how complicated it is. So I start Googling, like, what is vector calculus exactly? Seriously, like they never went through Algebra 1 in college.
Direction and force.
Or in school. I was homeschooled. Got my GED at 16, went to work as a plumber. Never studied any of this stuff. I had no idea how to do even basic algebra. And I just started researching, like 3D vectors. Well, how do you get distance? And what are forces? And what are spring forces? And what exactly would a cloth object be? And how would you define that? And I started experimenting. And so in a matter of a few weeks, I put together a functioning cloth engine. So I've been a programmer for about 3 months. I know zero about vector calculus. I sat there at my desk, learned how to do this, got the functioning cloth engine, put together a little demo, and showed up at the next meeting with my computer and the cloth engine running. And all of these senior programmers who were just like, first of all, I'm beneath them because I'm the new guy. And the boss spins it around and says, you guys who say that, we can't write our own cloth engine, look what Rich did. It was this moment of just like horror. And so guess what? They decided to develop their own cloth engine. And immediately the senior programmers were like, we can't let this, So I was disruptive. And
so do you have a lot of friends?
I probably have more enemies than friends, but it's always these kinds of things.
That's interesting because my reading on Feynman, there's a great book on him. It's called Genius, and why I read books on physicists, I don't know, they're fascinating. Read one on Fermi too. Fermi was Enrico Fermi, and from Italy. He was fabulous, a lot like Feynman. They were both kind of tinkerers, could figure things out. It's just interesting because, you know, you look at physics, you look at the programming world, you think about the law of least effort, okay? And then I was thinking through this and I was like, okay, so Feynman's wife dies of consumption. She dies of glandular tuberculosis, okay? At that time, there was essentially a newly discovered medicine. Actually, it was a medicine that had been discovered years ago. It had been started to test in like 1941. His wife dies, I think, in 44. He couldn't get the drug to her because it hadn't been approved yet. I think it was rapamycin or something like that, or rivampin, but couldn't get it to her. But it's just, you've got physicists that build nuclear bombs, okay, and then are pushing at the end of the 1950s into the first part of the 1960s. I think they're getting to the point of string theory, okay. Meanwhile, over in medicine, they're still looking. So these guys are down to like the smallest of particles. Like, we've taken electrons, we've broken the electron down into even smaller particles. We've taken those particles and broken them down even more. That's why we have these big colliders, or it's like we have these big electron accelerators so they can slam them together and find more particles, right? And they're envisioning in their head, they're like, okay, now what's really inside the electron? Well, it's a cloud, okay? Right, which is fascinating. All right, so they keep breaking it down. Meanwhile, over in medicine, which medicine is art and science, they're still looking through microscopes trying to figure out all of the different cells that are in the blood. And they can physically look through the microscope. They don't have to imagine, okay? It's not till the 70s and the 80s and the 90s where they finally figure out pyrogens, all right? And what causes a fever. I think there was a gentleman from Harvard that started studying it roughly in 1938 or something like that, who goes on to figure out interleukins and how leukocytes talk to each other. Like, there's got to be this force going between the leukocytes that tells them there's a fever in place. Well, it turns out there is, and there's a title for it, or a name for it. It's called an interleukin. Okay. Then there's another force that tells to tell cells to stop doing things. Amazingly, the name's called an interferon. So in physics, all right, they're over here doing string theory. In medicine, they're over here still looking through a microscope trying to account for all the different cells in our blood.
Yeah.
Like, one is completely visible. The other one, these guys are like sitting there inside their brain trying to figure out all this stuff. Amazingly, here's a thing about Feynman. He actually went and worked in he went and worked in the DNA lab at Caltech and is on one of his sabbaticals, and figured out an element of DNA sequencing that the guy that was running the lab later goes on to use what Feynman figured out, extrapolated on it, goes on and wins the Nobel Prize in genomics.
Yeah. You know, there's the Big Bang Theory.
Who banged it? That's what Pastor Miles would say,
Yeah.
Pastor Miles McPherson.
First there was nothing, then it exploded.
Yeah, which was written by a Catholic priest.
It's based on Hubble's observation of redshift, right? And to me, it's fascinating that no matter which direction you look from our vantage point on Earth, stars are moving away from us, which seems suspicious to me. And no matter how far away they are, the farther away they are, the more of this redshift you get. So the faster they're traveling away from us. And given that, the universe seems to be expanding. So it must be that the universe at one point was all contained in one single point, because it's all moving away from us, and it's moving faster the further away, so there must be this thing called dark matter. And so you've got like all of these foundational principles in astrophysics
Mm-hmm.
that they're trying to confirm, and it turns out that the Big Bang Theory predicted a whole lot of different things, and so the merit of a theory is based on its explanatory power. It's wrong on every level, so the Big Bang Theory is on its last leg. It's going to be dead soon. So I'm reading about uh, fiber optics, and in fiber optics, you actually have to modify the frequency of light based on how far it travels, because it's a known phenomenon in uh, fiber optic engineering that the further that light travels, the more it shifts to the red.
Isn't that Planck-Einstein?
Could be.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the equations for resolving this issue, and it occurs to me. So the further away the point of light is, the more it's going to shift to the red by the time it gets to you. Yeah. So there's two possible explanations for why distant stars are shifted to the red, and the more distant they are, the more they're shifted to the red. One is the further away they are, the faster they're moving away from us. Another one would be this known phenomenon that fiber optic engineers have to account for, which is the further light travels, the more it shifts. Which is the more plausible explanation? Something that is known and testable, or this theory that the universe is getting bigger? The further away it is, the faster it's getting bigger. And for that to happen, there has to be this anti-matter thing that is like billions of times more strong than the force of gravity in regular matter. And
So
why don't the astrophysicists and the fiber optic engineers have a conversation at some
what's fascinating? Well, that goes because I mean it's people do specialize and only study what they study, which is goes back to when I was like, well, why do things like that happen? It's a lack of an open mind. It's also that you can look at it on a certain level. Don't get me started on funding. That's crazy. But in bibliometrics, but it's like people like doing what they do. They enjoy it. They continue to study it. It is a form of entrainment where you keep just diving down that rabbit hole. But when you go full circle, where physicists have a tendency to pop up in philosophical discussions.
Yeah. And I think the reason for that is maybe at the very, very bottom of all things that exist might be consciousness.
Yeah.
And we've tended in the universities, the physicalist position is currently, well, it's shifting now because of some new sciences coming out, but the physicalist position is that conscious activity is dependent upon chemical activity in the mind, and so what exists at the lowest level is physical reality, and everything beyond that is a product of or emerges from physical reality. So consciousness comes from chemicals. Why do we believe this? Because we believe it. Because that's consistent with the evolutionary model, or that's consistent with, well, the philosophy of science, which is, things that are testable, and so we like that idea. Well, why not just propose the other way around? What's so wrong about that? Maybe the physical world exists because of consciousness. Consciousness is below that. So there's actually tons of peer-reviewed literature that's coming out that is promoting this idea, and it relates to quantum physics. So there's ways that we can look at it mathematically now. We can actually do science related to this model, and yeah, it's just interesting, this huge shift that's happening.
Great resource podcast that I love, although it takes me 4 days to listen to his podcast is Dr. Andrew Huberman at the Huberman Lab. One of the posts I looked at on Instagram yesterday was a link into a Caltech neurologist who's sounds like he's studying that concept, because when you break it down, you read, some people say that, okay, memories are stored in neurons. Really? Because some of the stuff I'm getting is saying that it's actually, memories are put back together because of chemical reactions that are taking place. Okay, so then therefore the big question is, where's the memory actually stored? Where does it exist? And one of the books that really got me thinking on memories and the ability for the brain to, I don't want to say regenerate, but repair itself, is Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep. And great book. He's a PhD, did a lot of work, obviously did a lot of work and a lot of study on sleep, wrote a book about it. But one of the things that happens when we're younger, think about this, if a portion of your brain gets damaged and you're able to regenerate, relearn, and so on and so forth, how is that possible? Well, one of the things, read the book, that takes place is that as we have this just vast neurological network, all these neurons in our brain when we're children, and what happens as we progress up to adulthood is it prunes down, and things, I don't want to say get solidified, but that's the term that comes to my mind, is that network gets put in place, which that's, just off the top of my head speculating, it's like one of the reasons why children can learn multiple languages if they're exposed to it, because they have this just vast network that can take it all in, and then it gets knocked down over time. So my whole thing is like, where is that memory really stored at? Like that whole left brain right thing, you can take that, throw it out.
Yeah.
People have different personalities, so on and so forth. You say, oh, so I'm mildly ambidextrous, and like, oh, you're mostly a right brain person. Well, I'm creative, but I can also be very organized when I set myself to it. So, and 7.5 lessons on the brain. That was a pretty good book. But yeah, it's, I think that's one of the reasons you and I have good conversations, because you do go back to first principles.
Yeah, when I started to talk about this conversation that I have with multiple developers, here's the problem that I'm looking at. And sometimes, like, I will hit a problem that is just like, I have no idea where to even start. The last one was, a Bezier curve takes points in space and then draws a smooth curve between them. Well, what if you have a smooth curve already? What would be the points that would generate that Bezier curve? We need software that does this. Go figure it out. So that was my job. And so I'm looking at, well, there's these libraries for curve fit that are using linear regression and all this crap. And they don't give you like the constraints that I'm working with. Like how many points do we need? Well, we don't necessarily know how many points we're going to need for this curve. So we would have to answer that question before we could even use this library. And this library is going to give us an output based on evenly distributed points. And I know that we don't want evenly distributed points. So I could try to use this library, but it's really not, it's made for a more broad, general way of fitting curves and whatever. So I sit down with a couple of developers who are pretty smart guys. One guy does robotics for Amazon. The other guy is just generally a programmer. And I'm explaining this to them. First thing, isn't there a library that does this? And it's like, every developer, isn't there a library that already does this? It's that idea.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of these libraries, but just on principle, maybe this isn't super efficient, but on principle, I hate using a library that does this task for me. There's a certain point where it becomes ridiculous. I'm not coding in binary,
Right.
But just as a general principle, I always want to get down to, okay, there's a library that does this. What does this library actually even do? And a lot of times the stuff that these libraries do is just overblown, overinflated, and not necessarily efficient. And it's using some like the Bezier curve library, for example, is just using an equation that's literally like a couple of vectors times t. Super, super simple to create this stuff. And in fact, I think at one point I came up with this equation on some project that I was doing. It worked for that other thing, and then I just threw it away and kept moving on, and it's running some code somewhere in the world probably. I was working on like broad phase collision detection for identifying objects that are in proximity, and you get this n squared problem. I'm just going to go jargon here for a second.
No worries.
And it occurred to me, I can really easily sort things like based on the center, which side are things on, and that reduces my n squared problem in half. And then it's like, I could do the same thing on this line, and I could top and bottom, and I could do that on front and back. So on the x, y, and z-axis, I can divide the world in half, and then I come up with these segments. It's like, oh, I could make a tree that would do it here, and that coming from no math background and no programming background, it's just like this is a really efficient solution for sorting the world into smaller groups so that we don't have to compare every object to every other object. And I implemented it. It worked really fast. And then I was talking to one of the developers about it, and he's like, "Yeah, that's called an octree." Really? There's somebody that's already done that? Yeah, And so but that happens to me all the time, where I invent some really cool solution, and there's already a mathematician who has a name that it's named after.
Well, that's cool. I mean, I run into that. Essentially, I'm on the sociological side, and I'll run into that. And before I started reading Anti-Fragile, I read one of the books of all things that I pulled out, the hunter-gatherer metaphor or analogy that I use is that a salesman is a hunter-gatherer. Like he has to go out and find the prey or find what he's picking up and then sell the product to him. Okay. A good salesman is completely anti-fragile. You cannot break a good salesman. There's only two things you can do with a good salesman. All right, if you're on the buying end, and that is buy what they are selling or run like hell. Because if you spend time with them, you will end up buying what they're selling minus the time that you spent with them. So if you like the product and you think it's a relatively good deal, just buy it and move on so you can get the time back. Because if you hang out with a good salesman, you're going to end up buying it anyway.
Yeah.
But the good salesman is an example of being anti-fragile. It's a good example of being a hunter-gatherer. Because that good salesman, they can go from cars, all right, and then, oh my goodness, Harley Davidsons were huge a couple of years ago. They probably still are. I'm not tracking on them. Cooling economy, they're a luxury item, so they're probably cooling off. All right, that good car salesman hops over to Harley Davidson, starts crushing it again. Oh my goodness, there's a housing bubble or a bubble in the real estate market. Prices are going through the roof. It's commission based. They're a good salesperson. Go pass the exam. Go sell houses. Because the title of the book was "Everyone is a Salesman."
Yeah. Well, maybe we should write a book. Everyone is a genius. I get called genius like daily. Anytime I meet a new person, they're like, "I think he's the smartest person." I'm convinced that I'm not a genius. I really don't think I am. I think that there's a couple of principles, the stars aligned, and coincidentally, my path in life has caused me to skirt certain things that prevent most people from becoming geniuses. So maybe we could list like some of the things that prevent people from being able to do what I think is normal what's certainly normal.
So
for me.
what prevents people from basically being able to maintain an open mind, do whatever they want to do for a living? Because I got to see if I can remember them. You can have time freedom, but you may be poor.
Mm-hmm.
You can have financial freedom, but you may have lost all your time. You can have health and fitness, but maybe you're sacrificing your time and your finance to support your health. And then you can also have spiritual freedom. Okay. It is rare to meet a person that has all four of those. And I'll tie this in with what Keynes would say is that each of us accepts a certain level of misery that we're comfortable with. So, and I had a friend of mine that I was in the grade 8 groups with, and she puts out, she's like, I'm only comfortable making like $580,000 a year. And I'm like, where in the hell do you come up with $580,000? Like you just pull that number out of your backside? And she's a good thinker. She had sat down, she'd started her own company. She was a mompreneur. That's a mouthful. Great lady, great story. I'll have to give you her information. You should have her on a podcast. You probably know her from the Innovation Collective. So, but she's like $580,000 a year. I'm like, good gravy. So I'm doing the math in my head. And I'm like, that's pretty much $50K a month.
Yeah.
I'm like, so, but her, in a Keynesian term, maybe I'm misconstruing this, her level of misery that she was willing to put up with or discomfort that she's willing to put up with is associated with a level supported by $580,000 a year. That means she has the 5-6 bedroom, 4,000 square foot house. She doesn't clean it. Somebody else comes in and cleans it, buys a new car every 2 to 3 years, probably leases, because if you're just going to replace your car every year, just lease. It's a better way to go. Okay. Comfortable in that world. That's what she likes. That's the way she lives. Likes to travel a lot, likes, spiritual in her mindset, so on and so forth. But, financial, time, health, and spiritual. It is rare to meet a person that has all four of those linked together. So what are some things that can get in the way of that? Well, one, how you're raised. Dead Poets Society is a great example of that. The main character, the kid that ends up acting in the play, kills himself. Why? Because his dad had selected his future for him. He's like, you're going to go to this school, you're going to get the good grades, you're not going to be an actor, and then you're going to become a doctor. And he's like, well, that's not my dream, that's your dream.
Could we just shortcut to presuppositions, things that you assume to be true? For example, every time I'm saying, well, here's a mathematical problem that nobody's been able to solve, to the people around me who have been educated in the universities are going, oh, you think you can solve that? Seriously? Great minds, whatever. And I'm just going, well, why not? So that this belief that because someone who is smarter than me couldn't figure this out, therefore no one will ever be able to figure it out. Does that really make sense?
No, it doesn't.
So
But you can infer from it, and if you want to be lazy, it's a good excuse.
Yeah.
When I was little sidebar, when I was probably 22, 23 years old, I figured out a way to stay alive in terrorist environments. And that is simply do not stand next to Americans. Okay, now it comes down to how do you figure out who's an American other than that they speak English? Okay. Generally, they're the ones complaining the most. Yeah. So now I'm going to go like, why are we complaining the most? Because most of the time you run into people and you can only know them for a short period of time. It may be that you've met in minutes and they'll look at you and go, you know what my problem is? Why do you have to have a problem? So which led me down the path of essentially positive speaking. Is it a problem? Is it a challenge? Is it something that we're going to overcome? Yeah. So, presuppositions are there. So let's think about this.
Well, I agree with you. I spent 6 weeks in Romania. When I came back, every conversation is like people complaining about first world problems. I was so angry and disgusted with America.
Oh,
like
so
what you're saying is totally true.
So to tie all that together is do not stand next to Americans in foreign countries. Stand in your own little area. Go get to know the locals. Hang out with them. You're probably not going to get blown up unless they sell you down the river because you're rule number one, don't be a jackass. But let's take that same thought, move it into the sporting world. Okay? Roger Bannister comes into mind. The thought of breaking the 4-minute barrier in the mile, Epstein wrote a great book on this. I'm trying to remember Epstein's first name, but might be David Epstein. Wrote a great book on this called The Sports Gene, and he talks about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. People's like, oh, you break the 4-minute mile, your heart's going to explode, your legs will explode, your brain will explode. Like, what scientific evidence do we have to say that your brain is going to explode simply because you run faster than 4 minutes for a mile? Tie this into the fact that the greatest athletes in the world, athlete number 2, extremely talented, no motivation, is probably sitting on the couch somewhere in the world and simply does not want to run. Yeah. And could probably go out with a little bit of training and shatter the world record in the mile without having their brain, their heart, their legs, or anything on their body explode and go back to sitting on the couch afterwards. But people say, oh, you're going to. So
wouldn't it be funny
that's a presupposition. And here the other one. Think about, so Roger Bannister does go on and do this. He does it on a cinder track on a cloudy, kind of rainy, a little bit windy day, not perfect conditions, where he took the previous 2 weeks to the effort. He went out and went hiking with his friends. So basically tapered himself into it. I'm sure he had some hard efforts in there, but tapers himself in there and then goes in and runs faster than a 4-minute mile and nothing explodes. Okay. Factor this one in, what I consider to be the greatest sporting achievement of all times. This is a great discussion question to ask people because most people, they don't even think about it. Why would you? Okay? Because it's important. I think the one hanging out there is breaking 2 hours for the marathon. Okay, Sports Gene talks about that too, or it might have been Alex Hutchins and Endure that I read both of them at the same time. But let's think about this. I think the greatest sporting achievement of all time rests with Alex Honnold, who free soloed the nose route on El Capitan. So when the nose route is first put up, it is aid climbed. They drive in stakes into the wall, they pull on the ropes, and they aid climb it. And it stays that way until Lynn Hill of the Stone Masters, who were some of the most dedicated rock climbers on the face of the earth. They were the Camp 4 dwellers in Yosemite National Park. They ended up closing down Camp 4 because people would just live there during the summer. The rock climbers would, and they would hang out on the wall, literally hang out on the wall climbing. But Lynn Hill was a Stone Master, female climber. She sets the nose route. She free climbs it, which means she puts her protection in the wall in case she falls, that the rope can catch her. She free climbs it. She sets it free, I think, in roughly 1997. Okay? At this time, one of the things that's just starting to come into the scene of rock climbing is free soloing, which is no protection, no ropes. Okay? So, and Alex Honnold may have the greatest sporting achievement of all times, because there was another guy that I watched a special on. He's dead now, but was a phenomenal mixed climber. So rock, ice, alpine, all that stuff. So Leclerc comes to mind. So, but Honnold free solos the nose route. He trains for roughly 5 years to do this. He free solos the nose, climbs it in under 4 hours. I think he did it on a Tuesday, because after he got done climbing the nose route, an exposure where if he slips just a little bit in some sections, he's falling thousands of feet to his death. Like, the exposure alone freaks me out. My hands are getting sweaty just thinking about the exposure of being up there. Free solos it, does it in a little over 3.5 hours, goes back to his van, and because it wasn't as much of a workout as he was looking for, goes and starts working on his hangboard and continues working on his grip strength, because it was a Tuesday and that's what he does on Tuesdays. But if he were to look at it and have presuppositions to say, this is never going to happen, I'll never be able to do this, his brain is going to get locked up on the most complicated pitches of the route, and he's going to get encompassed by fear. So that's one of the questions that interviews ask him. They're like, Alex, how did you deal with that fear when you're on the route? And he's like, well, and one, I acknowledged that it was there. Okay. And kept going. The difference that you'll notice between the great athletes, your Olympic athletes and your world-class athletes, your world record holders, and your amateur athlete is, amateur athlete rolls up to the starting line, you ask them what they're feeling, they'll say, anxious.
Yeah.
I'm about to puke. I'm that nervous. The world-class athlete rolls up and says, I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to try this out, and I'm thrilled that these world-class competitors are here, because they're going to push me to a place that I've never been before. They're taking those presuppositions of how they may do in the race, and they're throwing it out. They're figuring out how to use the energy of the people around them to work better. So, yeah, presuppositions are evil.
People in historic theology, philosophers and theologians, a lot of them have said things along the lines of this divine mystery claim. And this is a divine mystery. No mortal man will ever be able to comprehend this. All divine mystery is wrong on its face, because, first of all, you would have to fully comprehend this idea in order to know that it can't be comprehended. So there's a logical contradiction in the claim. Second, you would have to fully comprehend the comprehension abilities of all mortal man for all time in order to be sure that this thing that can't be comprehended, that you now understand, will never be comprehended. Then the same is, you can say the same thing for any kind of like a mathematical problem or athletic achievement or something like that. It's like, how do you know no one will ever be able to run faster than a 4-minute mile? But wouldn't it be awesome if it really was that, like, you get to like 3 minutes and 59.98 seconds, and your brain literally just explodes. You cross the finish line. Oh, less than 4 minutes.
That would have been scary. I would have still encouraged people to try because it could have, it's most likely just a fluke. I mean, you got to think about it. There was some dude out on the plains of Africa, somewhere on the Serengeti, chasing after an animal that probably broke the 4-minute mile barrier and didn't know about it.
Oh yeah.
He was just, what he was doing? He wasn't, people say he was chasing dinner. He wasn't chasing dinner. He was chasing food for the next couple of days. He was chasing protein.
The guy who, Bezier curves, everybody who's in graphics or animation or some kind of computer, simulation related stuff knows what a Bezier curve is. The guy who invented Bezier curves worked on Renault, the cars.
Renaults. Yes.
Renault. Is it Renault? How do you
No, we just say Renault. We're F1 fans around here.
Renault? Okay. It's spelled Renault. He wanted to make a nice curve, and so he was experimenting with ways to draw curves, and he figured out this fairly simple formula to get these curves, and then they put it into the design and into the production, and somebody had already invented it, but they didn't become famous for inventing it because they didn't put it to a famous car. So multiple people invented Bezier curves from different sources. And, like with the runner in the Serengeti, how many math problems have been invented by who knows how many hundreds of developers that one guy has his name associated with it.
Right.
And I also wonder how many of these unsolvable problems have people solved and it never got attention because they did it for some project that they were working on or some company, or maybe it's proprietary somewhere. Maybe one of the other obstacles to greatness or genius or whatever this thing is that we're talking about would be that the challenge is just overblown. It's over exaggerated. I suspect that might be the case with P versus NP. Have you ever heard of that one?
No.
Most math people will be familiar with P versus NP. It's hard to describe it succinctly, but it's essentially like, say you had 500 different objects and you want a computer that finds the only one that's red or something like that. Well, once we've found the one that's red, we can verify that this is the red object. But to search for that red object takes computing time. So why is it that we can verify the data instantaneously, but to search for that data takes so long?
This sounds like something Google solved.
Or tried to solve, or, is there some philosophical puzzle here that maybe we're just thinking about it in the wrong way or whatever. And I suspect that it's one of those things that's like trying to run a sausage grinder backwards to make hogs. So,
yeah, that's not going to work.
If you asked, like say you had a whole array full of values, 3, 7, 5, 14, whatever, and you got a sum of all of those values in that set of numbers. So now we have a sum, 374. All right, from 374, without any other information, let's reconstruct that array of vectors, or array of numbers. Well, you can't do that. It's logically impossible. So we can't move backwards in time, even dealing with abstractions. And maybe there's something in there that is the reason for entropy, because this principle exists even in logic or in Platonic formal reality itself somehow. And so I suspect that P versus NP is some version of this intuition that maybe we can run the sausage grinder backwards to make hogs.
No, what I've read about entropy in chaotic situations is the way to restore order, and this isn't me, this is Taleb, is to actually restore order in a chaotic situation or a disordered situation is to impart more disorder. So it's the, vibrate a pool table. The example he uses is vibrate a pool table. Okay, so you have all these different oscillations going along and all these balls operating on different frequencies, right? And it goes into entrainment. If you want to get all those balls to hop at the same time, impart more disorder. In other words, impart more shocks, a bigger shock underneath the table to get all the balls to hop at once. So when you do that, instead of all the balls just sitting there vibrating and going all in their own different directions, if you hit the bottom of the table hard enough with a large enough force, they're all going to hop at the same time, roughly to the same height, and come back down at the same time, in which case they're going to encounter the same amount of disorder they had before. But I would imagine once that they're lifted up off the table and they're floating, essentially floating, affected by gravity. Perfect physics only exists in a vacuum. That's a different state to take a look at them.
Yeah. Well,
So to go in sorting information, I would look at it as fascinating. So we're trying to sort it using math and so on and so forth, and work backwards into it. Maybe maybe the point is, don't try and put the hog back together, okay? But if you wanted to sort and figure out what's iron and what's not iron, just take a magnet, okay? The iron's going to get attracted to the magnet. All the other stuff's going to go away. Maybe you just have to resort after that.
Yeah.
Kind of like the tree you were explaining before.
Yeah. And it occurred to me, well, maybe there is some way, like using broad phase culling algorithm or something like that to reduce the problems with P versus NP. And in certain situations there are, but what I suspect is that people use really vague language when describing the problem, so that we can't see clearly what we're looking at and trying to do, and we think that it's more complicated than it actually is. And so in order to maintain the illusion, the prestige, we just intentionally...
That, in my mind, is what I call academic writing. There are a lot of research papers that I'll read, and you create a service just from translating this research paper into easily readable and understandable terms. Now, the math gets a little crazy sometimes, and when they're looking at the different sets and statistics and how they broke it down and so on and so forth. But just to be able to break the study down, because they're like, well, we're comparing these two groups, and they use a lot of, the research papers that I read, they use a lot of speaking in the negative or the opposite. So we've determined that it's not this.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's like,
then you can go on forever.
It's like, oh my goodness, because it's like, we've opened, we haven't really, in my mind, we really haven't eliminated anything when we said that. Like, we eliminated one thing, okay, trillions to go, gut biome. We've determined it's not this bacteria in your gut that's causing this. We only have, 900,999,999,000 to go. Oh, I wonder how long that's going to take. And I'll be like, if I'm sitting there looking at maybe lab samples from that, it's like, okay, I'm going to call Rich and we're going to see if we can write a program on this. And, we're going to see, can we get some groupings going on here and some sorting. But it's, going back to the genius thing, it's kind of fascinating. How's Einstein get to where he's at? Einstein has a great quote that I like, and that is, he says, practice anything 15 minutes a day for 1 year and you'll be an expert.
Yeah.
And then he goes on, he says, do it for 5 years, you'll be a national expert. And I have a phrase that one of the things that I try and teach to my sons is, athletically, this is what happened with me, is that I can generally find my way to the front of any group. Okay, and that's just started as a kid. Like, I was really strong lifting weights. Like, what 7-year-old is clean and jerking over 100 pounds as a 7-year-old? Okay, I wasn't even thinking about it. I didn't have the presuppositions. I was like, it's a pile of weights. I could lift a pile of weights, and I just kept trying. Eventually, I did. But then in football, I'm not the biggest guy, but what do you have to do? You just have to keep running and put the ball in the end zone, right? Okay, sometimes you run through people, sometimes you run around them. As I got on the smaller scale before I switched to cross country, I would run around them. I'd use my speed. Then I get hurt. Then I go into cross country. Take my football mentality with is like, guys, we win. Okay, we're winners. That's what we do. We win. All my football teams, we win. So I don't know what the hell you've been doing around here, but we're gonna win. And had a team that went on and won the state title.
In
No
cross country?
Yeah, no presuppositions. So, but I use the phrase, it's called find the front. You know, if you keep, like, you figured out how to find the front. You didn't do it through what people would say is the traditional method, but if you can find if you're, what I tell I put this out to my kids and my athletes, my sons and my athletes, I'm like, you have to be willing to wrestle with the problem. Okay. You want to run the 4-minute mile? Guess what? All right. Your Jim Ryan is what's called a quick adopter or a fast adopter. Jim Ryan is considered one of the greatest high school milers of all times back in the 1960s. I think he grew up in Kansas. Guy was a crappy athlete. Starts running because he just wanted to run one lap on the track faster than everybody else to say that he had done something better or faster than everybody else. So he started working at it. Within like 18 months, he's worked himself up to the level of the 4-minute mile and becoming the first high school runner to ever break in America to run faster than the 4-minute mile. Brain didn't explode, heart didn't explode, nothing on his body exploded. Okay, but point being, find the front, but you have to wrestle with the problem. In the Navy, it can be the advancement exam. So people will be like, I suck at taking advancement exams. Well, there's skills that we can teach you if you're willing. See, and it goes back to.
So they have this presupposition.
It goes back.
I suck at this.
It goes back to my one of my first principles when I meet people is everyone will have a problem, or everyone thinks they have to have a problem. Okay, because then it's an excuse, which then allows you to exercise the law of least effort, which is like, oh, I don't have to work at math. I don't have to, by the way, I got the biology book for $27.
Which is another way of running away from personal accountability, personal responsibility.
Yeah, because it's like, one of the reasons that we do need to schedule our day and have challenging moments. Like, I'm not really going to be completely useful tonight because we will have had 2 to 3 hour conversation. That's mentally.
It is mentally exhausting. I did the 5-hour podcast, and the next day I'm like, oh.
Yeah, it's just, it's draining. It's almost as much energy as riding the bike. Yeah. But you have to wrestle with the problem. And it's good to have conversations like this and have someone challenge you on your thinking and like, do you really know what you know? Well, I think I know what I know. What do you know? Yeah. And it's like, well, have you ever looked at it this way? I call them Gordon moments. I try not to pick on myself too much. But they'll be like, I'll struggle with the problem. Somebody walk up and be like, oh, have you looked at it this way? And it's just like, you want to hug them and you want to slap them. Yeah. Because it's like, yeah, I've been thinking about this for years. And that little pinprick you just gave me solved the problem. And he did it in like 2 seconds. Like, my oldest son can solve a Rubik's Cube. Kid can do it in he can do it like 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Just depends. I've never been able to solve it.
Did he? He probably looked it up on YouTube.
No, he just figured it out. I just handed it to him. I was like, hey, here you go.
Huh. Figured it out on his own to solve it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't do that. I did learn how to solve them, but I followed steps and learned the patterns and stuff.
Yeah, he might have looked it up on YouTube. I can ask him about it. But the thing is, I could look at it on YouTube and I still can't get it.
Yeah, you probably could if you could get rid of that presupposition that I'll never be able to solve it.
I'm going to take the law of least effort and put it into effect and say I can spend my time doing something else.
I've been organizing a curriculum that outlines the obstacles that people have to, I guess you could call it becoming a genius, or being able to go back to first principles, or basically I think what people ultimately need is they need to get out of just the chaos of all of these ideas that they hold that are wrong, all the things that they know that just aren't so, and to get rid of those and get down to first principles. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to illustrate the divine mystery fallacy with a 5x5 Rubik's Cube? Just start the conversation. Who here believes that solving this is beyond the comprehension of mortal man? No one will ever be able to understand how to solve that. And then while I'm talking, solve it. just as a, something that'll stick in people's heads, because it's actually not that hard if you follow tutorials, YouTube and stuff. They teach you the principles, and you learn those principles, and then you can solve this part of it, and then you learn the principle for the next part, and then you can solve the next part, and then the last one is the corners, which is kind of the hardest one, because preserving everything else while you're moving the corners around takes a few steps. And so there's some limitations, and you have to kind of do this round, several times through this cycle in order to move the pieces into the right place. But if you interact with the Rubik's Cube and you think about it, and then especially if you go and you do the cheats and learn the principles that other people have discovered, you can learn to solve a Rubik's Cube. It's not that hard.
Which is interesting is that you use that, no, you use similar technique when you're solving problems for your coding, is that you pull the research that's available to you and you utilize it, you apply it, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But what keeps most people from stepping out and say achieving genius level, which is, it's always nice when you're at Coffee and Concepts, because then I'm not the smartest guy in the room, so that's cool. I do have just a plethora of like things that I pulled in from reading, and it's kind of cool, because in that aspect I can connect things. I can be like, okay, why in physics are they getting to string theory and struggling in medicine looking through a damn microscope trying to figure out the cells, and it takes them 40 years in medicine to get where they were in physics back in the 1960s with string theory. It's not a great comparison. Some people would say it's apples and oranges, but it's still there. It's just kind of like, don't get it. But what gets in the way for most people is, can you roll it back and say it's Maslow's hierarchy, and that's kind of or it has been disproved for the most part. But that first layer is security. Are you comfortable with, and listen to our current political leaders speak? It's like, we need security, we need protection. You go back to the founding fathers and they'll tell you that if you sacrifice freedom for protection, that's Thomas Jefferson, right? The Thomas Jefferson quote.
Yeah.
That if you sacrifice freedom for protection, you deserve neither. And it's a bad paraphrase.
Well, I think there's a direct link between this idea that I want somebody in power to protect me, and it's because I'm afraid, and so I'm going to sacrifice. There's a link between that way of thinking and stupidity. Maybe that's the word.
Well, but also think about it in terms of, so what Anti-Fragile talks about is you can be fragile, robust, robust/resilient, and then anti-fragile. What we do is when we shift that up to what I would say a higher authority, say the government provides protection for us. Well, I don't need to provide protection for myself. Kind of like thinking that an immunization provides ultimate protection for you. No, it doesn't. It bolsters your immune system. It gives it a little taste, a little flavor of what can possibly happen during an infection, and it teaches it how to take care of that pathogen when it does enter the body for a second time. All right. But it will not keep you from being, it will not make you completely immune if a massive viral load comes on top of that and basically overwhelms the effectiveness of that immunization. That's a breakthrough infection. So think about that in terms of national security. Well, okay, our military is responsible for our national security, so on and so forth. We've got millions of people go out there, they kill bad people, that's what they do. I write code. You still need to have situational awareness. Those same people and those same police officers, so on and so forth, are not always going to be there for you. A little bit of situational awareness goes a long way. Like, don't put yourself into a bad situation, and then you're like, I'll just call the police. Well, rule number 1, don't be a jackass. Don't put yourself into a bad situation where you can possibly get beaten up or your life taken, from you because you lack situational awareness. You're fragile. You're pushing that off onto another part of society to take care of you. That's not good. And so should we? And we hear that pushed a lot. Like the Patriot Act is a great example where people just rolled over and said, hey, we need to give up these freedoms so we can have this protection. Well, what if we were just full force multipliers? I'll freak a lot of people out on this one, and that is, what's the best thing to do when you're being shot at? Shoot back.
I was going to say the first thing I would do is probably drop to the floor, provided they're not shooting from the tops of buildings.
Yeah, so you go all analytical on it, but the simplest thing to do is shoot back. All right. What's the best preventive medicine on the battlefield? Overwhelming firepower, engaging the enemy at the longest reach possible. So in other words, if I can call HIMARS from 100 kilometers out, long range artillery, if I can call HIMARS in from 100 kilometers out, and I don't have to get up close to the building and kick down doors and kill bad guys that way, yeah, I'm just going to bring a rocket through the window and
there was a video game called Bard's Tale, and it was more about the story and the humor, and so the game mechanics weren't really fleshed out very well. And I discovered that the range on the bow was slightly more than the aggro range. So you get the enemies where they're just barely on the screen, and you can shoot them with a bow, and they wouldn't notice you, and so you could kill these enemies. So I'm a level, 5 character, and I'm taking on level 14 areas.
Yeah.
And I completely screwed up the story and
So it's interesting is that as a gamer, there's going to be a point where technology is so prevalent on the battlefield that it will be. I'm trying to think of the movie where the kid directs the whole battle and they have them thinking that it's a simulation.
Ender's Game.
Ender's Game. It's going to be like Ender's Game. You're going to have kids in there
like that
that are thinking through strategy. The nice thing is it's essentially the colonel or the general knows how to recognize the genius that gets the job done.
Yeah.
Now they do this, that psychological trickery was pretty evil because he thought it was a simulation. He didn't think it was the actual one. So when he's sacrificing ships and saying this is the way we do it, he thinks it's a simulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm familiar with the books. Yeah, we read the books. My wife and I read sometimes books together. Of course, we own the movie and whatever.
That's like putting Alex Honnold up on the nose and telling him, no, it's just a simulation. If you fall, it's only a foot.
Yeah, and there's that weird thing, that principle that when you don't think there's anything to lose, then fear stops being part of the equation, and you can do things that you could never do before. Yeah. Maybe there's a way we could bottle that. It would be really cool.
I think it's there for a reason. That can kind of relate into you saying like one of the things that keeps people from being or achieving their genius level physically. One of the things, there is a concept that Dr. Phil Noakes puts out, and that is what keeps us from being able to run ourselves into the ground or exercise or grow ourselves into the ground or ride ourselves into the ground. In other words, you pretty much cannot kill yourself with exercise because your body, or it's actually your brain will shut down your body. And it's the U-shaped curve of endurance. So you start out fast, you settle into your pace for your multi-hour, multi-day race, and then you speed up at the end. Why does that happen? It's a brain-body relationship. It's actually your brain slowing your body down, according to Dr. Phil Noakes, or Timothy Noakes.
I know the psychological progression. You start out, you're full of energy, and then you start to feel the burn, and then you're like, I better develop a steady pace because I got to go a long way. So when you get towards the end, it's like it's time to start pushing again. I know that I go through that progression when I'm doing a big climb or something.
Yeah.
So it might be that it's part.
And can you take that and apply it to life? Because I'll say the ultimate endurance event in the world is life. All right, but if you take that and apply that to life, there's one of the reasons, like, look at the way that we age. Peter Attia is the source when it comes to longevity, in my opinion. But as you age, you start to, your body starts to recover more slowly. Why? Because you're old. You're not meant to be the tip of the spear in the hunting tribe anymore. You're not meant to be out there chasing down the animals. You're meant to be in the back, okay, directing and leading because you have all this wisdom. So think about it in terms of how we came to where we're at. Like in the hunter-gatherer days, if you were an old gray-haired guy like we are now, okay, you're a source of wisdom. You don't get to wrestle the animal to the ground and put yourself in harm's way because we need your wisdom. The saying in Africa is that when an elder dies, all right, the library goes with them because they've got all this knowledge. Yeah. All right. So when, let's think about it. So one of the reasons that the body recovers slowly is to move us from the front of the pack towards the back of the pack. So we maintain the wisdom so we can pass it on. That's actually in the form of DNA. All right. So our DNA gets passed on. All right. And why do we, the other thing is, well, why might we start struggling with memory, so on and so forth? Same reason, like
Getting old, you mean? Or?
yeah, getting old. It's the same reason as you're not meant to be up there at the front of the pack anymore. But I think we're also starting to disprove that, because it used to, you hear the phrase, oh, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can't learn new things as an old person. Like your brain's just wired together. That's absolute complete crap. Okay. Neuroplasticity is what neuroplasticity remains into older age. Andrew Huberman will tell you, but there are certain things that we can do to maintain that. And one of them is, so it's not just a brain body connection, it's a gut brain connection. And there are certain things, like literally, taking care of your gut biome can improve your memory, can improve your mood.
Yeah, I tried doing one of those cleanse type things, and there's a million different versions of it. And it ended with just feeling really, really normal and being able to function optimally for quite a while, until I started eating, crap again. And
yeah, and it'll totally, like, we're going through the process. If you look around, we're slowly weaning out the mass-produced wheat products, stuff that goes through the agricultural industrial complex. We're slowly weaning those out. I still will have the occasional Oreo. All right, a little bit of processed sugar is not going to kill you.
A little bit.
So
having it regularly will definitely.
Still like to drink microbrews, things like that. Cut that out as I'm heading into a big race. Usually I try and get 3 months of no beer before a race. Failed miserably on my last one. Yeah, with weaning out the beer, I was like, just last race.
How'd you do in the race?
I got 203 miles with 17,800 feet of climbing into a 500-mile race.
Oh.
It was brutal. At one point, I thought my wheels were creaking and making popping sounds.
Yeah.
It was the road, because it was so hot and the road was melting and popping a little bit. So, but I also used exogenous ketones, which can change your perceived level of exertion, because I'm riding up this 2% grade, 13 hours into the race, just outside of somewhere in Oregon, Eastern Oregon. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a 2% grade. Like, literally I should be in the big ring, middle of the cog set, humming up this thing. And I'm like in my small ring, 3 to 4 gears down, just grinding up this thing. I'm in just total endurance mode. I'm like, this sucks. Sun's going down. I'm covered in salt. And I'm like, why does this feel so hard? This is ridiculous. And I come back after the race and I start doing my research on exogenous ketones.
Yeah.
And exogenous ketone salts, one, screw up your hydration level. So when your hydration gets screwed up, that can affect your performance by up to 25%. And it's been noted in some studies, which are subjective, that it can change your perceived level of exertion. So not using exogenous ketones next race. But yeah, that screwed me up.
Was there a supplement you were taking?
Yeah, it's a supplement. So as a fat adapted athlete, so in ultra endurance, you just can't put enough carbohydrates in your body. What you do is I use roughly 200 to 400 calories of carbohydrates. So 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour to keep my brain happy. That's it. The rest of it is my body's just pulling fat stores. Okay, so because when I race, I'm a fat adapted athlete, which is why you'll see me, in the morning I have MCT and butter in my coffee.
Bulletproof coffee?
Yeah, so I do my bulletproof coffee in the morning. I generally only eat 1 meal a day. Okay, and I'm time restricted between 5 o'clock. I start eating at 5 o'clock in the evening with dinner, and I stop eating at 8 o'clock. And I'm only eat 3 hours out of the day. And then when I'm on the bike, I generally won't even eat for the first 6 hours. Now, last race, I changed that. And I was eating within the first 6 hours, thinking, hey, I got to go for 500 miles, got to eat within the first 6 hours. And it just blew up the system. It was, but, live and learn.
Yeah, a lot of experimentation to figure out. Probably your personal genetics play into that somewhere too.
Yeah, and then all that ties into, so why do you, why is it, things I think about, why is a person drawn to that? Well, one, it's a good thing to have something out there in the future that you're looking for. That's good for your dopamine levels. But two, it's like, people be like, well, that was a great race and you got a great result. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, but the journey. And they're like, what? I'm like, the journey going up to it, all the training I had to do, the mountain lion I saw in 2018
Yeah.
that scared the crud out of me. Like it was the single largest mountain lion I've ever seen. In my mind, it was 14 feet tall and stretched all the way across Blue Creek Road, but that's because I'm at the end of a 6 hour ride. It's like over 90 degrees. I went up Blue Creek as a mental check to be like, okay, it's an easy climb, but it's 8 miles long.
Mm-hmm.
And I was finishing up a 110-mile ride on gravel, and that was the final 8 mile climb to get up to like a 10-minute descent to a 20-minute, 25-minute easy spin by Fernand Lake to get back here. And I saw that mountain lion, and I was 2/3 of the way up the climb, and I was just like, turn around and go back down. Mountain lions are tracking creatures. It's probably noticed me coming through here over the last several weeks to several months. It's sitting off the side of the road over there. Damn thing knows I'm tired. In fact, you can probably see my computer and see the salt stains. It's calculating its leap, can do this. I'm going to get my butt kicked. By the way, what do you do when a mountain lion attacks you?
On a
So,
bicycle?
yeah. So anyway, I ended up riding past it, and the adrenaline kicked in. I wasn't going full speed. But I did have a lot of room for a sprint, and I was smoked, and I was like, right now I can sprint.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Did
so
it chase you?
no, but they will track you, and
Yeah.
they do know that they figure out your habits.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, man, I hope this thing's not tracking me. And I was like, because that's why you always want to train with a partner.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in that case, all you have to do is just be able to sprint just a little bit faster. So, but you don't get stories like that if you're not willing to go train and put in the work. You get a great. I also saw a moose. I think it was either before or after that. I saw a moose, and then I saw a fox. I had one ride. I called it the wildlife ride. I saw deer, elk, fox, moose, raccoon, squirrel. Like because I don't listen to music when I ride, so I'm just out there. And of course, cows.
I never listen to music when I rode either.
But yeah, so it's always the journey. It's like what'd you learn this time?
Yeah,
What'd you learn
we,
along the
we
way?
bought this house recently, and it's a fixer-upper, and it's gigantic. It's a really big house with all kinds of problems. And I'm looking at this just going, oh, this is so cool, because the kids are gonna be helping us to like tear down the old ceiling and
Mm-hmm.
cut the concrete to put new pipes under. And already, I've got my 8-year-old is running the gas-powered saw.
Are you on slab?
Yeah, the whole thing's on a slab.
You
There's
don't
no
want to
crawl
run
space.
your plumbing in your overhead?
You can't do that with drains on the first floor. So
You got a point there.
yeah,
Right.
gravity.
Everything else you can do in the overhead.
Yeah, you can. There's parts that are sheetrocked, so where I can, I'll probably just run under the concrete, so I don't have to tear out as much sheetrock. But we're gonna end up doing all kinds of stuff. I bought a backhoe. Well, it's a front loader with a backhoe, sort of a smaller.
Hopefully you didn't
tractor.
buy it from where I work.
Where do you work?
The one we have at the golf course is challenged.
Oh, no, this
Yeah.
is a Kubota. It's a nice machine.
Oh, okay.
B2601. And I let my 8-year-old learn how to use the loader, and he just took off. He's driving around with the backhoe, moving dirt around, or with the front loader moving dirt around. And then I taught him how to use the backhoe. I let him dig the trench in the backyard that connects the new plumbing to the septic, and he actually did it. He just experimenting with the things until he figures it out. And I gave him some pointers. You gotta kind of drag it forward as you tilt the bucket so that it fills up, and then you lift it up, and And so yeah, he did a great job with that. But the fact that we've got this house that needs all this work, you could look at it and go, oh, I wish we had a better house. Or you could look at it and go, this is going to be an awesome experience turning this into a better house. And once we're all done, it's going to be kind of sad in a sense.
Yeah, that's actually pretty common. Is at least in my world, post race letdown.
Yeah.
I know in 2020 I did a 24-hour race, and I came home and I was just on fire, in how I just feeling really good.
Mm-hmm.
Had a great race, and really couldn't wait to put my bike together on Monday and go for a ride, and was just amazed at how good my legs felt that Monday. So I'd raced Friday, Saturday, took Sunday off to fly home, swung a leg back over the bike to do a recovery ride on Monday, and was just like, couldn't believe how good I felt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was amazing. But then you also get the letdown. It's like, okay, what's next? And that's where I think we have, we have to be really careful, which is don't just pick an event to pick an event. Like one of the guys I follow on YouTube is the Plant Powered Runner. And he's done something that I see people do all the time where I'm going to sign up for an event because it'll force me to train and to get in shape and to do the right things. It can absolutely blow up in your face if you don't do the right stuff. And then what you end up doing is forcing yourself to try and suffer through an event that you didn't prepare for, which dings you psychologically, dings you physically, and can create a lot of bad habits. So I always recommend to people, I'm like, look, I know you spent the money, but if you're not ready, don't do it.
Yeah.
And I have friends that are like, I can't believe you told so-and-so not to go do that race. And I'm like, they weren't ready for it. But they still get the journey of trying to prepare for it, and you can still learn from your mistakes along the way.
Yeah. So I feel like reiterating some of these principles would be good. Like,
Okay.
This idea,
We didn't write anything down.
faster people have tried this. What's our response to that? Or smarter people have tried this. Our response to that is, and? So?
Okay.
What were you thinking?
Evolution tells me that we're always getting smarter.
Yeah, and if you interact with, other people, they're going to immediately attack your character. It happens to me. It happens all the time, especially to me, because I do this a lot, where I take on the thing that nobody else can do, and
So my question to you is, how do you defer that? How do you bring the situation down to get people to believe like, hey, yes, we actually can solve this problem, or I think we can make a headway. Or
what I did at first was try to justify it. So people would, it was happening like on a daily basis for a couple of months where I'd be having a conversation with somebody and I don't even know what I'm talking about, but the person suddenly just starts attacking my character. Well, who do you think you are? And I'm trying to like figure out, what did I say? And then I'm going, well, no, look, I was talking about this, and this is not unusual, and I would try to reason with them, and then I realized I was defending myself.
Right.
So I was taking the bait. Somebody attacks your character, and you start defending yourself. I realized that was my gut reaction, then I made a conscious choice. The next time someone attacks my character, I'm not going to take the bait. And it just sort of fizzles, and then the conversation could move on, which sounds strange, but it's either that or that escalation cycle.
Well, so don't feed the fire.
Yeah.
Okay. So don't feed the fire. To go back into the ultra endurance community, it would be like you can't do Race Across America. I don't want to hear that. I can say why. I can say why not. Well, because X, Y, and Z. But
and so then let's say I said, well, who do you think you are? And that the person might be threatened by what you're doing. And that's the thing. When you do genius level stuff or exceptional stuff.
What's interesting is self-confidence to the point where other people are going to manage the self-confidence to the point where other people, I guess, don't feel uncomfortable with it. So, and that's why that's a good question, which is how do you diffuse the situation, which is don't take the bait. Because then it can turn into something as simple as I'm right, you're wrong. Yeah. Like the one you explained when you wrote the code to figure out how to do the polygons and took hours of work and into 15 minutes. Like a good leader, which sounds like your CEO was, is ecstatic.
Yeah.
Like, look at all the time we just saved. All right, let's go play golf.
Yeah.
And a bad leader is
threatened.
Right. And it's so that the person that sounds more like a manager, which you manage things, you lead people. Okay. Leadership's the art of influence. Be both positive and negative. So, all right. So we were on presuppositions, how to get them out of the way, some of the principles we covered. What was the first one?
One of the first one is the smarter people have tried this, stronger people have tried this. People run up against that and they just give up. And it's like, well, what kinds of things is genius not? Well, it is not this, and there's an infinite number of those, but that seems to be a pretty common one, so maybe it's relevant. I have this principle, and I tell my kids this, and I tell this to people who are studying theology especially and doing Bible studies or programming or whatever. There are these figureheads, some famous athlete. Well, that's a person that people look up to and they want to learn from, and what are your ideas and stuff like that. People who are the heads of mega churches. I'm in the theology world a lot, so there's the things that I'm going to bring up. And, this is theological dark web, right? People look at the heads of the mega churches and they look up to them, and you will invariably, like if you go to a small group at a big church, there's going to be people saying, well, what the pastor says on this issue.
And we talked about that, right?
Yes. So I like to say, whenever a pastor says something, one thing you can be pretty sure of is that pastor just said something.
They did. And the way sounds like we've been down it. You have been down more in depth in your studies, much more in depth in my studies, but been down the similar road. And I always say it's like you get people sitting in church for an hour and listening to the pastor. When Francis Chan puts this out, and he's like, I'm speaking to thousands of people. As a pastor, I have a responsibility, and I'm held to a higher standard because of this. Yeah. He would say scripturally, it says I'm held to a higher standard. And then they go out and they quote me, and I'm like, yeah, dude, plagiarism among pastors is rampant. Like, if you can't figure out what to preach on the weekend, just go copy somebody else's work. I see that. That's how you see that same theme traveling around the Christian community. It's the power of the Holy Spirit. No, it's the power of the internet and YouTube, and you're plagiarizing and hijacking their sermon and putting your own twist on it. Okay. You'll see that. And then, but isn't that the same thing with the person that shows up for the hour of power and be like, oh, let me hear what the pastor has to say. And it's like, dude, and then like, I'm guilty of this right now. Like, I haven't read my Bible in a couple of weeks, but I have read the entire Bible and studied it.
Yeah.
And it'd be like, well, what is your Bible study revealing to you? And then also keep in mind that is their personal Bible study. Like, yeah, you can learn something from it, but you need to get in and read it and study the scripture. Like, you go all the way back to the Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I ain't that good. So I'll just sit there and roll it
so
over.
Maybe that reveals another thing. That going back to the Hebrew, like imagine you decided to learn how to speak Hebrew. It sounds like, oh my gosh, this huge undertaking. I was able to go on YouTube, find somebody who did a video on the Hebrew alphabet, learn all the vowel sounds, all the consonant sounds, the alphabet, and then start reading words with a little tool that you can hover over it, and it gives you an English equivalent that's not exactly equivalent, but you can get a sense after seeing this word multiple times what it actually meant to them. I learned how to read and pronounce the Hebrew in about 2 hours. It's really not, because it's honestly, it's really similar to English. A lot of our English is at least rooted in Hebrew, believe it or not. Sometimes it goes through the Greek, the Latin, and then in English or whatever, but it's not as overwhelming a task as everybody kind of thinks it is.
So let me put this out to you. Think about this. All right, I'll relate it to when we're trying to keep a secret. If you and I share a secret between the two of us, the equation that accounts for that secret is it's equal to the sum of the square. So 2 people know us. We share a secret between the 2 of us. 4 people probably know about it. Okay, because I'm probably going to tell my wife, and you're probably going to tell your wife. So there's 4 people. Okay, 4 people know a secret. It's equal to the sum of the square. 16 people probably actually know the secret. Okay. I think when we look at one of the, and I want to apply this to translations in scripture and how things may go askew from the original, and that is we take it from the Hebrew and we translate it into Greek, we translate it into English, and then we have society that intermixes with that. Mm-hmm. Now we've got Hebrew to, let's just say Hebrew to English. Okay, we'll call that 2 languages. Sum of the square is 4, so there's 4 crazy things, or a 400% chance that things could go crazy. Then we account for society in there. Okay, now we got 3, so the sum of the square is 9. But inside society, we've got other things that are pushing it. So they can just go. And the whole, what I'd say, simple meaning can get lost because we've translated and we've had so many other forces pulling on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm in the, I guess I'd say I'm in the same boat as you in that because I remember my wife coming home from church one day and she's like, I'm good. I said the sinner's prayer. And I'm like, where's that in the Bible?
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Huh? You know, because I'm coming from, and my wife and I are exact opposites. Oh my goodness. I'm like the health and fitness guy, and my wife is like, yeah, whatever. You know, but she does accommodate me because she's very sensitive to my diet, and
Yeah.
basically makes things that I don't even ask. She just makes things for dinner that she knows fits the narrative of whatever I'm working on at the time.
Mhm.
But you know, here I am. Mine is my brother sends me a Bible in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 1990, 1991. I read the New Testament. I'm out walking across a sand dune. It was obviously the book of John, and it was obviously chapter 3. And I'm reading it. I'm like, wow, that's pretty similar. There's really nothing I can do to earn the grace of God.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, and to graduate from the grace of God, if we understood the grace of God is this being who is loving and gracious and has our best interest at heart. He's selfless, kind of like a mother with a child, you know, a good mother. You want the child to be safe, and you want the child to grow up and be able to do things, and you're investing in their well-being. And it's not necessarily because I'm going to get a big payoff one day. I mean, some parents might think that way, but it's more just instinctive that
Yeah.
you're going to care about this person. And so God is like this. He's gracious. He's loving. Well, that's great. Okay, so then what? Well, we've got all these problems. We're confused. We're selfish. We hate each other. We're lying to each other. We lust after things, and so we steal them from each other. We don't know how to live at peace with one another. The world is full of chaos and problems. So a loving God enters into this situation. What's he going to do? Well, the first thing he does is give them the law. And look at the law, Deuteronomy chapter 6. It says, I'm going to give you these instructions so that you can live at peace with each other, so that you can live long, so that you won't have plagues and wars breaking out in the midst of you. So God in his grace gives people instructions to help them to get away from the chaos and the error of sin. Sin is all these problems, all these errors. So any solution that God in his grace offers has to deal with the actual problem. And the Christian narrative essentially it's a mass formation psychosis thing. We focus on one tiny issue, and then we come up with there's only one possible solution to that tiny issue. And then leaders emerge who promote that.
Mhm.
Everybody looks to these leaders, and then we form these groups, and anybody who comes along and says there's something wrong with the system, they're immediately ousted. And so, you know, the real problem suddenly disappears. That's not the problem anymore. The problem is God's wrath. We've got to deal with God's wrath. We've got to deal with God's unforgiveness. There's only one way to do that. Jesus has to absorb God's wrath, and now God can forgive us. And that problem, okay, so now how do we take advantage of that? We got to be part of the group. So it's like it's the perfect pattern of mass formation psychosis. This just occurred to me today. And
Right. And we've talked about this.
Yeah.
So where I would say traditional Christianity looks at the cross and what Jesus did on the cross is it's the sacrifice that had to be paid because it's the blood covenant.
Right.
So it had to fulfill the old covenant. What Jesus did on the cross was the fulfillment of the old covenant in the blood sacrifice. So all sins paid for, past, present, and future, because of what he does on the cross. And
that's the narrative.
Yeah, and if I get your perspective right, or thinking along the lines of your perspective, is that that Jesus is an atonement, okay? But it's more than that, and it's more because of the relationship that he has with the Father that he goes and does
well, it's just what I said.
Makes the sacrifice on the cross.
People don't know how to live. People don't know how to have peace with each other. People don't know how to have meaningful lives. People are confused and they're lost and they're wandering around,
right,
serving Maslow's hierarchy, you know, lust of the flesh, and this results in chaos, and ultimately it all degrades and you have death. So,
right.
say you're in a healthy relationship and you bring some sin in and you start lying to that person. Well, what happens? Say you don't understand how your body works and you just eat whatever you feel like.
Right.
What happens? So you bring sin into a system and the system dies. And the human race is a system and it's full of sin and it's on its way to death. In order to correct this, we need education. We need to know what kinds of things should we value. How are we supposed to feel about people? How are we supposed to feel about our circumstances? And what Jesus is doing and what the New Testament says repeatedly, he's revealing truth that when you labor to believe it and then you do it, it leads to eternal life.
Which is good, because what comes to my mind is orthopraxy. So it's right thought and right actions. And I'm trying to remember what right thought is. I'm wondering, is it orthopraxy? Or orthopraxy is probably right actions. But it's, and I can go with that to say that Jesus, I don't know what he was thinking, although it does come out in Scripture, because he'll tell you things, and the reason that he does speak in parables is to make you think and to make the disciples think. Sidebar: how many people have read the New Testament? And you're sitting there, and this came up in my Bible group, and so my Bible study group back in Spring Valley, and it's like you're reading the New Testament. I remember this. So it's like probably the fourth or fifth time I read the New Testament. I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, when are these guys going to get it? Like, how dumb are they? Like, the dude walked on water. He calmed the storm. He is the Christ. Okay. But I'm looking at that from my perspective and all my, you would say presuppositions, things that have been pushed at me, saying like he is, like, it's blatantly obvious. Like, hello. Yeah, but these are guys, that fishermen that he picked up, that were mostly trained in Judaism, but I don't think currently had a rabbi. So Jesus is, Christianity at one point in time was looked at as simply another strain of Judaism, just a different rabbi. So, but the point being is yes, the cross is important in what happens there, but what I think a lot of people overlook is the relationship that Christ has with the Father. Okay. Some would say perfect relationship, perfectly obedient, because he asked if there was any way out of going to the cross, and God is like, nope, got to do it. And he's like, okay, I will go do it. Yeah. This is going to stink. And I think people miss that. And they also miss the forgiveness portion of it, is that all the times Jesus is challenged and slapped and spit on, and Peter takes out the sword and chops off the Roman soldier's ear when they come to collect him to go to the crucifixion. And Jesus tells him, like, get behind me, Satan, because those aren't right actions. Is like that's not what I'm trying to demonstrate here. I think that gets massively overlooked. So like in your reaction, like when someone challenges you and attacks your character, is, that's what Jesus does, is just like, doesn't necessarily say, why are you attacking me? But it's kind of like his interactions with Satan, which is he replies, man doesn't live on bread alone.
Well, this idea of not resisting the evil, even the concept of gospel of peace. How do you make peace with somebody? Well, this escalation thing that happens. Well, she did this to me. And kids do this all the time. Why did you hit your sister? Well, she did this, and then you talk to her. Well, why did you shove him? Well, because he hit me. And you just go on, and it escalates. At some point, if one person will allow the harm to be done and not retaliate with harm, then the situation suddenly is diffused.
Exactly.
And superpowers do this. They escalate.
Can we pause?
Yeah.
I gotta go to the bathroom.
The Calvinist mind is that everything is predetermined. So prayer is just theater to them. It's a little puppet show, or it's, and some Calvinists would argue, no, it's not like that. Determinism is where people go when they first get involved in Calvinism, and then they understand compatibilism. And compatibilism is not arguing that God determines everything. Compatibilism is arguing that yes, God determines everything, but he still blames you for the actions that he caused you to commit, so you're still responsible. So God caused me to do that, and there's nothing else that I could have done, but God holds me responsible, and I still have to suffer the consequences of my actions that he predetermined for me. Yes. How is that not a contradiction? It's just not. Well, how is it not? It's a divine mystery. Or you think you're smarter than God, and then they start doing the character assassination and whatever. But if God predetermines everything, then prayer is obviously meaningless. It's just
It's just why evangelize.
yeah. But if you actually go into the Bible and read it, you look at all the times where God says, "If you will do this thing, then I will do this thing," and God changed his mind about the thing that he purposed to do to them. So God can be persuaded. And I can actually persuade a person by engaging in a discussion with them. So my actions do have some impact. My actions actually mean something. Even my actions of praying to God, I might be able to persuade God to do something different. Or God might really just want to have that interaction with us, and so it's important on that level. But there's a number of different reasons to spend time praying, and the first of which is that it makes a difference, hopefully for the better, provided you have some idea of how things should be, which you might know if you have an idea of the character of God and what his will actually is. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, right? So there's a lot of things that need to be in place for you to be an effective prayer warrior, but anyway, prayer matters. When I first got out of Moody, and I thought I was insane or I thought maybe I'm insane because I'm looking at what all of these professors are teaching and how it's different from what the Bible plainly says. And they're all insisting, the Bible, it teaches this. Remember in the Bible where it teaches, and you go and you look and it's like, it doesn't say that. God hid his face from Jesus when he was on the cross. Where did you get that idea? Well, everybody knows that. Oh, well, let's read the story. God did not hide his face from him. Well, it says he didn't hide his face. What do you mean he hid his face? Well, he had to hide his face. But it says he didn't. So you've got the narrative, and then you've got and it's like, am I the only one that's seeing this here? Like, what is going on? Am I crazy, or is everybody crazy? What's more likely just on the surface? Probably it's more likely that I'm nuts and everybody else is right.
Well, go back to the the basic logic and what they keep challenging you on, and that is, sorry, got a pit bull over here that's whining. They're challenging you on the basic knowledge, like, are you smarter than all of these other people? Okay, well, so like, where did all of the other people get their start? At some point in time, Martin Luther had to stand up and tack his 95 thesis to the door and be like, hey, these are the things I want to talk about.
Yeah.
And that pretty much rocked the world of, I would say, religion, because he was studying to be a Catholic, if I remember, a Catholic monk. So, like, did he have some special genius qualities? I mean, he's challenging everyone, and it's
the thing with Martin Luther is he was one of many people who was engaging in discussions and debates and arguments throughout history, and he just happened to publish something the time that the printing press was invented, and it was the first thing to go viral. That's why Martin Luther. He was just one guy out of lots of people.
Okay.
Time and place, right time, right
so
place.
So it's the Carol Brady maiden name question to Google.
Yeah.
What showed Google that their search engine was drawing people in was who wants to be a millionaire, and the question was, and it's in the age of surveillance capitalism, and the question was, what is Carol Brady's maiden name? And they noticed, the Google engineers noticed that it seemed like at 48 minutes past the hour, they were getting these spikes and surges. And what it was is the different time zones across the world were showing who wants to be a millionaire. That question would pop up, people would Google it, and boop. So here's Martin Luther, just happens to coincide with the creation of the Gutenberg printing press, which
Yep.
the first book that the Gutenberg printing press produced was the Bible, and the first book that was a big hit for the Oxford printing press was the Bible, still the number one selling book in the world
Mhm.
of all times. So, but I just I looked at going to seminary in San Diego. I forget the name of the school that was there, but really didn't have a good feeling about it. But and it would have been an MDiv, but just didn't have a good feeling about it when I went in, and
Mhm.
and just so when people are pushing back, like what you said about the pastors earlier, like you know more about the Bible than we do. We're afraid people are going to follow you. Well, you don't follow the pastor.
Yeah.
You follow Christ.
Yeah, I was going into this meeting with the pastor of Real Life Church, and it's the biggest.
I know.
Yeah, it's the biggest church here, and I was reading in Colossians where it says, "Beware lest anyone, what is it, make spoil of you through philosophy, vain deceit, according to the traditions of men." And it translated that word tradition as deliverances in this one translation. I thought that was weird. And so I did some digging. It turns out the word that's always translated tradition, it means like surrender. And it's surrender to the will of another. So some person has issued something that you're supposed to do and you buy into it. Tradition is this process of basically be my leader, whatever that thing is. It could be an ideology, it could be a group, it could be a person, but you're surrendering your will to something that is ultimately man-made. And then it's like, okay, well, now I need to have a whole, I don't know, year's worth of study on power structures and what's going on there and people surrendering to them, and the fact that the word paradosis, that is this surrender to somebody else's authority, is the only Greek word in the whole New Testament that has a numerical value of 666. So let him who has wisdom calculate the number of its name. It's like, is this a principle here that the Antichrist concept, the spirit of Antichrist, is this thing where we surrender our will to another as opposed to personal responsibility? Anytime you look at somebody who is deceived, who's part of a cult, they lack that sense of personal responsibility. I need to come to these conclusions on my own. I need to make sure that this stuff is true and not just trust the leaders. And people who have that within them, who are currently part of a cult, usually will, given enough time, they're going to come up against the problems and they're going to end up leaving or getting ejected or something like that.
Yeah.
But then the people who stay part of it are the ones who are loyal to the tradition. So this whole concept of the Antichrist and the mark of the beast, it's got to be related to this concept of surrendering your personal responsibility to some man-made system or figurehead and telling them, protect me in exchange for loyalty and tell me what to do.
Well, I think you're biblically strong enough to answer this. Like, where in the Bible does it say that the current church has to look the way that it looks? Like, you have to have a physical building on a street corner in the United States of America, led by an MDiv that's been through this school, who's both a pastor and a minister.
You know,
It's I'm just like, it goes into, okay, so I'm going to go sit there for my hour of power, listen to what the pastor has to say, and then I'm going to go out and use my little bird leadership and say, my pastor says. Billy Graham, I think, has the better quote or the better way, and it says, the Bible says. Okay.
Yeah.
And Graham was out there on some stuff. Like I have issues on Graham and his crusades because the studies that I've heard quoted, all right, I'd have to go and look them up, are that 97% of the people that were supposedly saved at the Billy Graham crusades do not have a relationship with Christ.
Well, he's got the wrong gospel. He was using the evangelical narrative for his gospel. It's the same thing that Ray Comfort uses. It's the same thing that's just everywhere. it's part of this mass psychosis thing, where we've created a different problem than the one the Bible creates or addresses. And the new problem is sort of the law or the legal code or the justice of God or God's righteousness, or that God must punish sin, or that God can't forgive, or his wrath, or the problem is all God. Sin would be great if it weren't for the fact that God doesn't like it, so we got to deal with God. Or something like that. The problem is God. How do we fix God?
How do you fix something that's omnipotent,
Yeah.
all knowing?
And
Omniscient?
I mean, I'm not joking about this. The professors at Moody, when they present the gospel, they say the cross is primarily, if not exclusively, about changing God, changing his attitude towards our sin. So it's almost entirely, maybe entirely, about the effect that it has on God.
I can, and I can totally see that perspective, because if you're kicking back and you're reading, if you didn't know anything and you were just to read the Old Testament and then kick over into the New Testament, you're like, what happened? So the Old Testament is all legalistic, follow the law, do this, wash your hands this many times, cleanliness is really important. If you don't do this, you don't burn this incense, you don't kill this animal, like you don't fulfill these sacrifices, like you're out, you're not in it, But although,
If you read part of the Old Testament, and
Yeah,
it's
but
weird that you say that, though.
but now you kick over into the New Testament, right? And it's all forgiveness and so on. And you want to be the first one to cast a stone at this woman, and then out of that group, the first people to walk away when going to cast the stone,
Well, if you just
are
read
the
the
all
law,
the older guys.
I could see having that.
Yeah, I mean
experience.
it's like, so you got Old Testament, which is all tradition and the Old Covenant. Well, actually, there's 7 covenants in the Bible. So you got Old Testament with the older covenants, which are all legalistic, which is, basically
Do's and don'ts.
Yeah, do's and don'ts all written out, because then you got the 10 Commandments, but then you got Deuteronomy, and it's like Deuteronomy is like everything you can and cannot do. It's like, goodness gracious. All right. But then what happens is man gets in there and corrupts the law.
Yeah.
Okay. Because now we're all legalists. So now we got to have courts and we got to have judges and we got to be able to decide, did you break the law? And if you did break the law, what's the punishment for that? Because you got to pay the man, But then you read the New Testament and Jesus is like, forgive.
Well, he doesn't condemn the woman caught in adultery.
No, he doesn't.
He's violating the law.
He's violating the law when he
Even
walks
as-
through
yeah,
wheat fields on the Sabbath,
Right. And
stripping grain.
he doesn't wash his hands before they eat, which that's in, I think, Exodus 20. If you didn't wash your hands as a priest, at least, then instant death. Penalty is death. So Jesus is violating laws all over the place, which of course runs contrary to the evangelical theory that Jesus was perfect before God according to the letter of the law, thus fulfilling the law, thus taking the law out of the way, and like somehow that's how the old covenant is removed, by Jesus being perfectly righteous according to the old covenant. Which it's just a theory that runs contrary to numerous scriptures, but it fits that narrative of the problem is God, the problem is God's righteousness, the problem is the law. How do we fix all of this stuff over here? And people who both buy this narrative and are thinking people, they're going to come to the conclusion, as most evangelicals do, more than half, okay, then I can sin all that I want. So what's the incentive for not sinning? And then pastors come up with this, well, you lose out, you miss out on blessings.
No, you got to go back to Scripture, and Paul tells us, I'm pretty sure in Romans and several other places, it's like, I would imagine, I haven't read Scripture in a while, it's got to be in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because 1st and 2nd Corinthians is like the baby's milk for the Christian community. It's like easy to drink, tastes good, easy to get down. But then you go into Romans, and I'm pretty sure there's sections in Romans where he's saying, like, look, get your mind right and turn from sin, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be renewed. You're supposed to have a renewed mind because you know Christ. If and I think we all struggle with this, to say that we know Christ and continue to doing the same things that we've always been doing without changing and without having a new mind, then
Well,
then there's a miss
if
somewhere
we
in
think
there.
that we're saved from God and Jesus took care of that and it was a legal issue, and as long as we sign our name to a bunch of rhetoric, then we get to be part of that and we get to go to heaven, then problem is solved. We've been saved from God. Problems with
Fire
God
insurance.
fixed. We
Yeah,
just
you
keep
got your fire insurance bought and paid for.
Right. The trouble is sin is bad and it leads to death, and it's a disease like a cancer in your soul that has infected your mind and your emotions and your speech and your actions. And this thing that you're doing it's a path that ultimately ends in destruction
It's the path that leads you or
away from
dis-
God.
distracts you from the relationship that
Mhm.
Christ demonstrated for us to have with the Father. And
Exactly.
he had the perfect relationship.
And it was a relationship of trust, understanding, love. And you see this in parent-child relationships. You have the dictatorial dad who uses fear and threats and punishment to force conformity on the child, who then hates the father and can't wait to leave. And that's an old covenant way of thinking about relationship. And then you have a God is what, well, the dad who genuinely loves the son, who is also wise and experienced, and the son learns this through this relationship, this interaction, learns to trust the father. And when the father says, "Oh, you should stop right now," the son immediately stops because there's got to be a poisonous snake in front of me or something. Or whatever the father says, "Don't do this." The son has learned he can trust this father. And so, out of trust, understanding the love, immediately obeys. So, this obedience through trust relationship is the new covenant. And that's the faith that Jesus exemplifies, righteousness, which is of faith. It's like you said, it's this relationship of trust. And it's a transformation about the whole way that you think. And when you're in that relationship with the Father, you don't need the law. The law is obsolete at that point. It's passing away. The law is not made for the righteous man, but for the wicked, for adulterers and murderers and etc. And, you know, such were some of you. You were like this before you entered into this relationship. And now you've been transformed. And now if you walk according to the spirit of everything that Christ is teaching you, then you're not under the law. And you're going to be doing from the heart what is even more righteous than the law could ever hope to describe. And so salvation is this whole process of coming to know the Father as he really is, learning to trust him, changing the way you think about everything, being set free from all of this ensnaring sin and slavery to corruption and all that whatever. And basically you're set on this path of learning from God, following him, and being reprogrammed by this relationship so that you are worthy of eternal life and you can attain it, provided you actually are on this path and you are being reconciled to him and you are being set free from all these lies and delusions and lusts and all this stuff. And it is definitely a process.
Yeah. It's a continuous process. I mean, if you were to come back and talk to me 2008, yeah, that we wouldn't have had this conversation. It just would not have been possible because I hadn't read and studied the Bible.
Yeah.
I hadn't spent time in Bible study groups and discussing it, where you every now and then you have that guy that throws out that different point of view. That seemed to be me quite frequently, and I'd be like, well, what about this and what about that? And it's yeah, so I mean, I still struggle with big church, and my pastor says so. What Jesus demonstrates is one of the things that we teach young people is like, well, before you lead, you need to learn how to follow, and Jesus demonstrates perfect followership in his relationship with the Father, and he demonstrates leadership in the way he leads the disciples. Okay, so you cannot lead if you do not understand how to follow, and that's a great example with the dictators, and it goes back to we can go back to Dead Poet Society and how the way that guy was with his son. That's straight up Old Testament. Follow these rules, do these things, go do this. Life's going to be good.
Yeah, people. There's this whole debate within the church that kind of centers around justifying this Jesus made sin okay narrative, because
He
dealt
didn't
with all
make
the-
sin okay. He paid for the sin, according to the doctrines that have been presented to me.
Right,
He
for the
paid.
sin.
He paid for this. That does not make sin okay.
Well, he didn't actually pay for the sin. The Bible never presents anything like that. Automatically a heretic in the mind of every evangelical for saying that, but
Just
show me the verse. Seriously, just
you've
show me the
explained
verse.
it to me before.
Yeah, yeah. But there's so many different versions of this narrative, and one way to sum it up is all of that legal stuff, Jesus took care of it. Now I can go to heaven, and if I sin, well, he expects that, and I'm forgiven all my past, present, future.
Well,
So he made sin okay. That's really what we're saying. Why beat around the bush?
but so I still push back on that because he didn't. I mean, willingly.
No, I agree.
yeah, willingly sinning is. It's like you know. It's like what part of you? Okay, it's like here's the Bible. Read it. Gonna pray for you. Let's talk about it. And I'll throw this out, and that is this is having. I facilitated a Bible group. I don't want to say I led it. I facilitated it because we would sit down and literally. It would get ugly. It was the most awesome men's group ever. It was like seriously holding each other accountable. It's like, you know, moments of like you need to do your business or move on.
Yeah.
You know, basically like poop or get off the pot. You know, and quit messing around here. Either you're gonna have a genuine relationship or you're not. You're still welcome in the group. We're gonna pray for you and everything, but you can't come in here looking at the 4 or 5 or 6 other guys that are sitting around the table and ask us for answers. We don't have them. We've got scripture. We've got God.
Yeah.
Okay. If you read scripture, you follow scripture, you apply it to your life, guarantee you will see changes.
Yeah.
And I was once at the point of saying that if people just lived by biblical principles without even really understanding them, that they would be okay. I don't think that's possible because if you don't understand them, then you're going to misinterpret them and you're going to apply them in the wrong way. So you've got to have the relationship to help you understand them. All right. And so you go 1 week and the guy's sitting there and talking about scripture and you say, well, I think it means this. And it's like 180 degrees out from what it would be like saying, yeah, sin's okay because Christ paid for him. So therefore sin's okay. I can go do it. Yeah. But dude, Paul talks about that in Romans. It says, turn, allow for the renewing of your mind. And if you only read one book in the Bible, read Romans because it's the whole compilation.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, and then they show up the next week and they start reading scripture and they've had the aha moment. All of a sudden it's speaking to them. They're understanding it.
Yeah.
Okay. Something happened in that week.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened. Now, do they truly have salvation? That's not for me to answer. That's between them and God.
Yeah, I had the same thing with this men's Bible study group that I was going to. I called everybody to task because they were all, every Friday morning just the same thing about, oh yeah, I looked at porn this week too, but we have a sin nature. Jesus doesn't expect us to be like him. He was the only one born without a sin nature. And like, dude, what are you talking about?
No, he had a sin nature, but he just did not sin.
He had everything that we have, but nobody has a sin nature. There's no such thing. That's just a fantasy. There's nothing in the Bible.
I think
that says
people
that.
have a sin nature. I think we have a predisposition towards sinning and being broken.
Well, you can be broken and you can be corrupted. And you could call that sinners by nature, or become so ingrained that it describes them as being sinners by nature.
Yeah, okay.
But that doesn't mean that they were born totally depraved. It doesn't mean that they always had a sin nature. It doesn't mean that there's something in us that wasn't in Jesus that makes it so that he was able to go without sinning,
Okay, so
but we're not.
what I'll throw out is, what about the example of the pastor that always says, look at the toddlers. You don't have to teach the toddlers how to be selfish and evil and trying to take all the toys and control them for themselves. Is that not sin?
It doesn't mean that they are completely corrupt. Sin is ever present. It's all around us. And we can encounter it and we can integrate it. We can be born with it. We could be born, some kids are born way more pure than others. John the Baptist was full of the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb. And yet you have people God told the Israelites, kill the women and children, everybody. They were so corrupt that there was, so it's like, there's no cut and dry answer to how corrupt we could be when we're born. We could be really horribly corrupt when we're born, we could be really pure when we're born. There are a lot of different factors, there are a lot of different variables, there's a lot going on. All of that said, when a person says, well, I have a sin nature, so when I sin, God understands, and I'm going to keep sinning. No, that is not an excuse to continue in sin. Anyway, I was sick of hearing this same stuff over and over again, so I start, quoting verses about holiness and everything, and a lot of the men are starting to come around, and they're being more cautious what they say in front of me because they know that I'm going to expect them to give me the verse if you're going to make that kind of claim. So they can't just throw out the cliches in my presence. And the group is starting to be affected by that. We're having these conversations. They're like seeing my point of view. And then they go back to church on Sunday. And they get fed the same narrative. And get reminded, we're just going to keep sinning. We're born with a sin nature. Jesus knows that. That's why he paid for all those sins. You're going to fail. It's just going to happen. It's every man's battle. Whatever, this whole narrative.
There's actually a book called that.
Yes.
Every Man's Battle.
Yeah, and it promotes this narrative, and it's garbage. And please don't read that book, or at least if you're going to read the book, please don't believe it.
First Bible group I went to, that was one of the books they recommended. I actually have it in my library.
So these power structures that are businesses, they're a business model.
They are
in the church.
Where do you think the franchise came from? Come on.
In the
Get your Jesus. Sorry.
church was something that existed even before Jesus came on the scene. They just, in the Bible, it's usually translated synagogue, which means gathering.
Yeah.
People gathered. People got together in groups, they read the Bible, they had discussions, people would take turns reading the Bible and talking about stuff. You didn't necessarily have like a head pastor, but you had the scribes and the Pharisees who were sort of the paid professional churchers of their day. And of course,
Was it Pharisees were higher than Sadducees or Sadducees higher than Pharisees?
they worked for different groups.
Okay. Because I know Paul was a Pharisee.
Don't remember exactly.
Pretty sure. He was way up
I
there.
think the Sadducees were employed by the governments, and the Pharisees were more like Jewish priesthood focused kind of thing, but don't quote me on that. I don't remember. Of course, the authority, the power structures surrounding religious ideology, they were the ones who put Jesus to death because he was a threat to their power. Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Getting kicked out of churches. First time he spoke in the gathering, they tried to throw him off a cliff, So he was very gentle and delicate with his words and made sure not to offend. Well, okay, the opposite. He pissed them off so bad they tried to throw him off a cliff. And they eventually put him on the cross because of just this very simple concept of teaching a person to fish or giving a person a fish. Then they depend on you. And now you have power over them and you can control them. Tell you what, I'll give you a fish if you'll do. And to rise to power and to be able to manipulate people, this is what lobbying is. This is what our politicians are doing. This is why totalitarian governments emerge and the people get separated into the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And it's, a friend of mine just argued today that churches are basically communism because it's the same power structure. And the power structure has the narrative that they have to keep reinforcing. So the men's Bible study, I'm compelling them to do the personal responsibility, personal accountability. You need to know what the text actually says and not just listen to your pastor. They're starting to come around. They go back to the pastor. The pastor has identified me as a threat to their system. And so then the pastors of the church come into the Bible study to see what I'm doing, what kind of a threat I am. And then, so this cycle just keeps repeating. So what you've done with just abandoning church, I understand.
Well, there's when we first got to Coeur d'Alene, I was walking around and I was talking to people, and I'm like, hey, where are you at with God? Where are you at with Christ? And they're like, well, I used to go to church and blah, blah, blah. And, they would lay it out there. Remember one young lady at the coffee shop that she showed up at the home church we ended up attending a couple of times.
and now she's on the Messianic Jewish side and attending gatherings over there. But she just walks me through her whole story and how she ends up getting disassociated with church. And I'm like, okay. And I could not really, it seemed like every person I talked to had that story. And so there is, unfortunately, something evil going on, in my opinion, in this portion of the inland Northwest when it comes to church. Like Pastor Miles McPherson was my pastor at the Rock. And that's the teaching that I go back to, and when I'm just talking, I'm basically just repeating it matched with what I was reading in the Bible. It's, what I repeat. It wasn't indoctrination. Yes, there were altar calls and saying the sinner's prayer and everything. And I struggle with that.
Yeah.
And, but at the same time, I guess I can say I was willing to put up with it, to be around men and to be in a Bible group. But I also didn't have people crashing down the door of my house, sitting into my Bible group or sitting in the Bible group saying, well, you're teaching bad stuff. And I'm like, because we don't even have a curriculum. That was like one of my rules. I was like, we're not going to have a curriculum. Because how many times you show up and you're like, you're going to lead a med school? Oh, here's every man's battle. Lead the group through that. And I'm like, that's somebody else's work. I have to read. Not only do I have to read this book, I have to study this book and take it apart in pieces to see if it's theologically correct on what we're teaching. Much easier way to do it, law of least effort, is to walk into men's group with everyone have their Bibles, sit down and be like, all right, Rich, what's going on this week? What are you struggling with? Well, this, and this. I'm struggling with forgiveness. Okay, let's pull out some scripture on that and let's study it. What does it say? And maybe why are we studying? Why are we struggling? Why are you struggling, as a man with forgiveness? Well, this, and, so on, and pray about it. And the other thing is rarely do you pray about something and all of a sudden, like a brick hitting you in the side of the head. Oh, I get it. Normally it's pray about it.
Process. It takes interacting with the data,
Now we're going to
wrestling.
wrestle. Now we're going to go through the wrestling process, and you may not get an answer to that prayer. Well, I think one of the coolest things in the world, one of the coolest things about God is you can pray about something. Maybe you won't see any results. I've always heard that there are 3 things God can say, yes, no, not right now. Okay. And then a couple of years down the road, and you were praying for someone or something, and all of a sudden, bam, it's there, and you realize, and you're like, oh my goodness, I remember. And if you keep a diary and things you pray about, which I don't, you can look back. I can do it. Remember, I'm like, man, like 2 years ago, I prayed about that, and it's happened. And I remember, young lady at the coffee shop, remember praying for her. I was like, God, plug her in somewhere, bring her back. Okay. Looks like it happened. How cool is that? That's pretty cool. And, there, atheists would push back and say, well, that, maybe that just occurred because you interacted with her and you asked her to come to your home church and pray with you and interact and be part of worship. And maybe it was because you gave her the nudge that triggered something in her brain that's okay. From an atheist perspective. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
I totally get it, but it's...
So you suggested that there might be something evil going on with the churches in this area.
Yeah. You mentioned, I don't like to call churches out by name, but you mentioned a church that we investigated that we looked at when we first got up here, and I was like, we're not going to that
Is that
church.
Lake City?
No, we went to one service there, and we didn't leave. We didn't burn rubber in the parking lot on the way out, but I was like, yeah, we're not coming back here. I mean, they knocked it out of the park on the greeting and getting the kids plugged into the
they've
the
got a
child
great
care.
coffee shop. The
and then
woodwork is beautiful.
And
The Sunday school was good.
But we sat down for the first message, and it's a young pastor up there who's really probably never brought a message before and was on feet washing. And it's
Dark-haired guy?
Oh, I can't remember, but it was on feet washing. Well, one of the things, so like we go through worship, and Mel and I, like at the Rock, like worship is, I guess 21st century church. I mean, it's loud, hands up, people are praying, people are singing. You may hear somebody speaking in tongues,
Mhm.
I mean, it's full on worship, and like if it needs to keep going, like if it's like, then it keeps going.
Mhm.
And at least that's been my experience. And yeah, I know that the just the deep breathing and the physical movement will cause a physiological change in your body. It's one of the reasons you have worship, at least from a big church perspective. But we're in worship, and I'm like looking at Mel, and I'm like, nobody's got their hands up. And they're all very self-conscious about how they look, and then it comes out, and you get the message on feet washing, and you can tell it's a message that a pastor handed it to him, and he was like, hey, learn this. This is an easy sermon to put out.
Probably came from Rick Warren.
Yeah, and it's like, all right, I think maybe one of the golden rules, or a golden rule you can have as a pastor, is only put out your own stuff.
Well, but that's back to that principle of personal responsibility. And you can, like I said, laziness is one of the things that,
Law of least effort.
yeah, obvious effort that
I got like
accounts-
5 minutes, just so you
accounts
know.
for all this nonsense. The idea that there's something evil going on, well, certainly there's spiritual forces that are at
Yeah,
work.
absolutely.
And in the in the spirit world, there's certainly a coordinated effort behind all these churches. There might be someone who is consciously influencing all of these churches, who is actually committed to destroying the kingdom of God, or keeping people enslaved to sin, or something like that. And it would be interesting. But
Yeah,
along those lines, the conversation that I had with Mike Rama, who is the pastor of Lake City, it ended with him saying, the reason that we are asking you and your family to leave is this whole business of being led by the Spirit of God. And I'm going, wait.
Yeah. Yep.
I asked him, when do the elders get together to pray to seek the will of God for the church? And he looked at me like I was crazy, and they didn't do that.
And I'm trying to remember this. It's something that one of the ministries I've been a part of that will tell you that essentially that the power of the Holy Spirit was sealed after Pentecost, if I remember correctly. That when Christ passed, the power of this Holy Spirit was sealed. And that's a wild doctrine to me, because Scripture says that you pray, like it's okay to think you're praying to Jesus. What you're really doing is praying in the power of the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit is the great communicator.
Well, yeah, the idea of speaking by the Spirit, and
Yeah, because like you break it down, like I had a pastor one time, and he's like, who in here thinks they understand the triune nature of God? He's like, I have a PhD in theology, and I'm still trying to figure out that one. And what he was really good at was politics and public speaking. I don't know, like it's one of those things where I'll say he's aware of Christ, but I don't know if he knows him.
Yeah.
Which is, that's scary.
There's a passage in the Bible that says you should be perfect in your understanding, and you should grow so that you can be perfect in your understanding. And like I said, all divine mystery is false, and I will stand by that. The Trinity, and maybe we'll have a conversation about this at some point. I think it's easy to understand the Trinity if you can get presuppositions that come from the Christian narrative out of your head, and understand, like, very, very simply, in some ways, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one and the same. In some ways, they're distinct. And if we just go with what Scripture says about these different things, then we can come up with a more complex system than any codified creed of the Trinity or doctrine of the Trinity that is internally without contradiction, accounts for all of the variables in the system. So there is a right hypothesis that doesn't create any contradictions. It's just that it's more complicated, and you have to get rid of ideas that you already have in your head because of.
I will say where we're at with the church, and what we're talking about, what we're discussing with the church, and the changes that we would like to see take place.
Uh-huh.
Okay. One, definitely would like to see everybody know Christ. Okay. Salvation's a wonderful thing, and not just looking at it from a fire insurance perspective, but the three areas of society that are the slowest changing
Mm-hmm.
are, in order, education, the education system, government, and the trends that take place in government, neoliberalism as an example. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the church. The church, let me grab that. The church is absolutely the slowest moving, slowest changing portion of society.
So slower than government and education?
Yep. You can walk into church. You could have left church pretty much in the mid 1980s and come back right now, and the only thing that's changed is the music. There'll be a couple of new themes out there popping around, but there really hasn't been any new revelations, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, here's a new revelation for you. Let's sort out the difference between what we think is in the Bible. We'll throw all that stuff away, and then what's actually in the Bible, and we'll get everybody personally responsible to read it for themselves so that they're not enslaved to some personality cult leader, or they're not letting somebody else do their thinking for them.
Okay. So that will be me overcoming the law of least effort, because I'd really just like to read books. But it comes down to what we've done, okay,
Yeah.
which is strike up a friendship. We actually struck up a friendship over technology and discussing technology. We find out we're both Christian,
Mhm.
Christian brothers. And we took it from there.
Yeah.
Okay. So, one, I'll say that the overall church, the Church of Christ, I believe, is flourishing and is fine. I think the church in America, the physical structure, church on a corner church, has massive issues, struggles from a lot of poor teaching and a lack of revelation and a lack of truly seeking God's word through understanding or seeking to understand Scripture, because I struggle with the word a perfect understanding of Scripture. I'd have to look at a translation on that.
Yeah.
Because a perfect understanding, like the only thing in my mind that's perfect is God. Okay, so a perfect understanding of Scripture for I would say a transparent and realistic person so a perfect understanding
Well,
hurts my brain.
let's just distinguish between perfect and comprehensive.
So
I don't think anybody has a comprehensive understanding, but
but it's good, because the reason that I'm drawn to that and the reason that I like it is I've read passages in Scripture 10, 15, 20 times.
Mhm.
And it may be, maybe I'm going from 15 to 20, and the 20th time I read that passage and then I pray about it and I wake up the next morning and it's like, I finally think I understand what that means.
Mhm.
And I believe it's Matthew 7 where it talks about don't judge lest ye be judged by the same standard. Like, dude, I wrestled with that scripture for years. It's like, okay, don't judge people. Okay, so I'm wrestling. Finally, one day, and because all the gunk that's out there in the world, like the United States is a Christian nation, so we should have Christian principles. Yes, but not every person in the United States is a Christian.
Mhm.
So I struggle with that. And I'm thinking through it, and it's like, don't judge people. And it's like, okay, let me break this down and make it even simpler. If you and I decide the rules of a game, and we decide that we are players in the game, then we have to abide by those rules. Then I'm okay in saying, hey, Rich, you broke rule number 3. You went out of bounds here. It's a turnover, my ball, so on and so forth.
Mhm.
We can use lacrosse as an example. But what if the person doesn't agree to the game that we're involved in? They therefore don't agree to the rules. So for me to take something like gay marriage in California, for me to look at that and say, well, that's against the law. Well, biblically, it doesn't make sense. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. We can look at scripture and say marriage is between a man and a woman. That's what scripture says. Okay. So biblically, it doesn't make sense. But does it make sense for me to go over into California law and try and change California law so that law then goes back and reinforces what I see in scripture? Okay. I'd say the bigger issue comes if it's two people knowingly living in sin. Okay, and how do they reconcile that with scripture? But at the same time, I would also say that that's on them. Okay, I don't get to be the one there standing there holding a sledgehammer saying, put out your hand. I got to punish you for this. That's not my job. That's why I'm not, that's also why I'm not an apologist, because to try and prove God's existence, okay, it's faith. I believe God exists. Therefore, in my mind, he does. It is absolute faith. But to be an apologist and to argue with someone, and argue in discourse, I mean that. So to invite them into your church, to invite the atheist into your church, and to have a controlled debate on the topic of God is to put God on trial.
Yeah.
And then we assume the position above him of proving that he existed, or that he does exist. Oh no, that's not my position. I believe in God. It's based on faith. If a person wants to disagree with me, okay, because I think the only way I may have of possibly influencing their mindset and moving them more towards thinking that a God exists is by having my proper actions, them seeing the relationship that I have, seeing the goodness hopefully flow through my life, having a difficult moment. I had a difficult moment in a business relationship where I literally had to work through forgiving a partner on a high 5-figure investment because he's a very stubborn person, but he's also very brilliant. And I had to work through forgiving him, be able to hand the project back to him in hopes that it'll move forward. All right. And then we're talking money here, and nothing gets people more riled up than, well, he took my blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, I went into this to hopefully help him, to help him fulfill a dream, see this product go to market, maybe learn something in the process. And what happened in the midst of it was a train wreck. A lot of non-Christian argument happened. What moves it forward? Realizing that you got to forgive, hand it back. Okay. Maybe that action helps him see that, he may look at it and say, well, that guy's just a fool. Or maybe he'll see that, okay, his relationship with God allows him to do that and not carry remorse, and which you still have to work through. But I have had other interactions with him and been able to go up to, and like maybe some other people are going like, how can you two even talk to each other now? And it's like, do you, true forgiveness also involved, like true forgiveness means like, I would say you don't hold the remorse about it. Like, I don't think you can absolutely forget, but you can put the remorse off to the side. So,
yeah. Well, maybe the first principle of forgiveness is, are you committed to that person's well-being still? Are you loving them? And if you're not, then you've got some kind of sinful hatred that God's not even capable of.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. On that note, great
Well,
chat. That was awesome.
The next podcast, hopefully, Lord willing, will be about authority or power structures and how to identify them and how that relates to church and what we should do about it and those kinds of things. And hopefully I'm going to have someone who will be somewhat of an expert on that for our next podcast. So, the end.
Yeah. I don't know what I was an expert on.
Yeah, everything.